There was a bridge deck under my boots, and then there was not. The floor came up cold through both knees. Swept stone, a chalk ring drawn by a hand that had pressed too hard at the top of the curve, and a smell like a shop the morning after a careless torch. Above me on three sides, 400 children in gray coats leaned over a gallery rail and made the noise a crowd makes when it has waited an hour and has finally been paid. In the ring with me stood a girl of 16, chalk on 3 fingers, a coat with cuffs that came down over her knuckles. She was looking at me the way you look at a bill you cannot pay. A man in a gray robe came down the side steps, turning a ring of keys over in his palm, and stopped with his toes at the edge of the chalk. "State the species," he said to her, and he did not look at me once while he said it. "Human," she said. "There is no such familiar," he said. "Then write down what you can see," she said, and he looked at me properly for the first time and asked me for it himself. "Welder," I said, because it was the only honest answer in me. They laughed. It went round the gallery once, came back along the far side, and settled in. Under the noise, a boy 2 rows up was telling the person beside him about the afternoon he almost saw the royal carriage and got no answer, so he started again with the horses in. "Take one thing out of the next few hours, and take this. Of the 2 of us inside that chalk, she was not the one who had lost. Nobody up there cared what I was. They had come to watch a name at the bottom of a list finish exactly where they had already put it. 2 silver, said a boy at the rail. He said it down to her over the heads of the row in front, in a voice built for a room that size, and I could smell the orange oil in his hair from the floor. 2 silver, and the problem leaves with me tonight, he said. White gloves, both of them. And in all the time I knew him, he never took them off. He is not for sale, she said. Nothing here is priceless, he said. Priceless is only a word for a number nobody has said out loud yet. The proctor read the binding off a card he did not need to hold. A summoner feeds and houses her familiar. A familiar defends his summoner, and nothing dissolves either one except the master's own hand and her own mark on the page she signed. He said it the way a man says a thing he has said 400 times, and it went into my ear and sat down and waited most of a year to matter. Then he held out the form and asked her for the name. I have seen the box those sheets live in. Every name off that year has teeth in it. Ashfang, Bramblerack. Something a first year had called Gorse the Ninth, which raises a question about the 8 before it. She wrote Wes. Is that a name, said the boy in the gloves, or is that only what it answers to? It is his name, she said, and he set 2 coins down on the rail where the row behind him could see them, and laughed on the inhale. I have never heard anybody else laugh on the way in, instead of the way out. I never got used to it, and I heard it a great many times after that. Then the tether went slack at the top of the stairs, and 400 heads turned the same way at once. The drake came down 4 steps at a time, slate-colored, the length of a cart, a house crest swinging off the collar ring. He was not looking at me at all. He was looking past me at the girl with the chalk on her fingers. Here it comes, somebody said above me, in the pleased voice of a person who has never once been on the floor. Drakes load the back legs before they go, and everything does if it means to arrive somewhere with weight behind it. So I took a stride to her left instead of standing in front of her, and he had to spend something on a correction, and while he was spending it, I got my arms out of my jacket. The gallery thought I was rolling my sleeves. I was making a bag. He came, and he lost most of a stride to the turn and never got it back. And the jacket went over the eyes and the nostrils, and I had the low side of him with a hand up under the front leg and my hip in against his chest. He went down on the flagstones, and it was extremely loud, and then the hall was quiet, and the quiet lasted a good deal longer than the noise had. You never argue with the head end. You take the ground out from under one shoulder and let the floor do the rest. Bridge crews do it to each other on Fridays for money, and there is usually a hat going round afterwards. Then I sat on the shoulder with a knee behind the jaw and asked the room, in the most agreeable voice I own, whose animal I was holding. For a while nobody in 400 had anything at all. He did that with a coat, somebody said, and then said it again as though the second time would make it sit down properly. That is not a familiar, said a girl further along the rail. That is a man. From the instructor's rail, a woman's voice came over the top of all of it, short, and not impressed so much as busy. Get the drake up, she said, and somebody write down what he did with the jacket. Mine, said the boy with the coins. Come down and collect him, I said, and bring the 2 silver. He did not come down. His groom came down, a thin man with a burn scar across one wrist. The groom looked at me, then at the drake, then at the floor, in that order, and I got the impression he had already been blamed for it somewhere inside his own head. He asked me quietly not to let it up until he had a hand on the collar. I let the animal up, he shook the jacket off and stood there breathing. Then he did the one thing nobody in that hall was ready for. He did nothing. He put his nose down near my hand, where the glove was burnt through at the thumb, and left it there for the length of a breath, and the groom went the color of a wet wall. Get him out, said the boy at the rail. There was a crack in the middle of the word out that had not been anywhere in his voice a minute earlier. They got him out. The corridor was full of people pretending to be going somewhere. She walked through them with her chin up and her cuffs over her hands and did not slow down for a single one of them, and I went after her because I had no better idea in me. How many of them stayed to watch, she said. All of them, I said. Both sides, she said, meaning the instructor's rail, and I said yes. both sides, and she nodded twice and did not ask me the question she had come out into that corridor to ask, which was where I had come from. She did not ask it that day. She did not ask it the next one either, and I have thought about that a good deal since. The boy with the carriage caught us at the turn by the bell rope. 17, big through the shoulders, a griffin walking behind him with one wing carried wrong. That was the best summoning day in 9 years, he said. I nearly saw the royal carriage once. It was on the North Road, and I was up on the wall with my aunt. Nell said that was very interesting. There were 4 horses, he said, and then the crowd came round the corner and took him away sideways, and he was still telling us the 4th one was gray. Halfway down the west stair there is a wall with pegs in it, and it is the only thing at that school anybody actually looks at. 12 pegs to a year, a slot for each place, and a small wooden peg with the name burnt into it. A child moves her own peg with her own hand when her place changes. That is either the cruelest piece of joinery I have ever stood in front of, or the most honest one. I have had a year to decide, and I have not decided. Hers was at the bottom. 12th of 12, and she said the word 12th the way you say a surname, with no heat in it at all, like a thing that had been in the family a while. You will move it, I said. She said in the voice of somebody reading out prices that the wall moved on performance at the monthly muster, and that performance was scored on the pair rather than on the summoner, and that a pair meant a summoner and her beast. So in her case, she said, the score would come out as an instructor's private opinion of a man in a jacket. She got most of that out on one breath because she breathes in the wrong places when she is explaining something. I said I had understood it the first time. She said sorry and then explained the last piece of it again anyway, slower in case the fault had been hers. The refectory has 2 windows. The big one is for students. The small one at the end is a hatch with a shelf and a woman behind it with a ladle and a slate, and the slate said meals for familiars. 2 coppers. 2 coppers, said the woman. Nell put her hand in her pocket. 2 coppers, said the woman again, in case the first one had gone past me on the way in. He is not a beast, Nell said. Then he takes a student's meal and that is 4, said the woman, and she put the ladle back in the pot with a small pleased noise. What do the beasts get for 2? I said. Awful, she said. Barley in it. 2, then, I said. I have taken that meal at that hatch 140 times since, and the woman has said the price twice on every one of them, and behind me somebody has always been arguing about whether a man who is a familiar is 1 meal or 2. It never got settled. It is not settled now. There are men in the capital with seals on their letters who have written opinions down about it. She had 11 coppers left. I know the number because she counted them onto the table out loud, twice, and then put them back in her pocket in a different order from the one they came out in. At the bottom of the stairs to the lower yard, a boy was waiting with a jar held against his chest in both arms. 13, maybe. Sleeves he had grown into from the wrong end. Inside the jar, something small was trying to make light and getting it wrong. It failed over and over in little handfuls, and every failure lit his chin from underneath. Sorry, he said, before anything else. Nobody had asked him to be, so I left it lying where he had put it. It only does sparks, he said. Everyone says it is a waste of a summoning. Instructor Teague said, you can have a beast or you can have a lamp, and I got a lamp that does not work. How many does it do in a minute? I said. Looked up at me. Then he sat down on the bottom step with the jar on his knees and began counting out loud, moving his lips because in his whole life at that school, nobody had ever wanted a number off him before. 211, he said at the end of it. Then he said, that is a good minute though. It is not always that much. His name was Sim Otley, and inside a year, the whole kingdom was arguing about his jar. Her house heard before the hall was swept. I know the hour because the postwriter goes out at 4, and the proctor's boy crossed the yard with a folded sheet at 3, and I know what was on it because Bittern told me himself later when he wanted something. House Ferrow paid 200 silver marks a year to keep her at the circles and paid it only while she performed. Nobody had ever needed to explain to her which half of that was the condition. Proctor found us in the lower yard at dusk. Anselm Bittern. The keys came out of the sleeve before the mouth opened, and he turned them over twice in his palm while he worked out how much of it to say. Regrettably, he said. I learned that word off him because he puts it in front of anything he intends to enjoy. Regrettably, a summoner whose familiar cannot obviously be fed out of her own means must post a keep bond. 5 silver marks at the muster, monthly. It is not a punishment, he said. It is a bond, and it comes back to her when she leaves. And if she cannot post it, I said. Then the familiar goes to reassignment, he said, which I administer. There is a small fee. He looked at me then for the first time, from the boots up, the way you look at stock standing in a yard, and he did his arithmetic out loud without meaning to. That habit has cost him more than he will ever know. There is a healthy interest in this one already, he said. He is not for sale, said Nell, from about 2 paces behind my shoulder, and her voice did what it does when she is frightened. It goes flatter instead of louder. Bittern smiled at nobody in particular, put the keys away, wrote the notice out on his knee there in the yard, and nailed it to the post by the gate himself. It carried a date and a figure, 5 silver marks, 60 coppers, 29 days. Across the yard, a forge was still going in a low shed with the doors open, and an old man sat in the light of it sharpening a hoof knife on a strip of leather with a pipe in his teeth. He had watched every bit of it without once stopping the knife. When Bittern had gone, he took the pipe out and said, "Well." Then he put it back in and went on sharpening. That was my first conversation with Baz Tuluk. It was 1 word long, and it was better than most I had that month. Nell went up to the dormitory. I stood in the yard with the notice on the post and did the only inventory available to me. A folding knife, a lighter with about a week left in it, a steel tape, 3 meters, the hook bent from a drop-off staging, 1 leather glove, burnt through at the thumb, a bootlace, 60 coppers wanted in 29 days, and a girl upstairs who had counted hers twice. I count in threes when I am working out whether a thing will hold. 3 points of support, 3 ways it comes down, 3 jobs before dark. It is a habit off the bridges, and I have never had a reason to drop it. So, she could not sell me, because she would not. She could not feed me, because a bowl of offal and barley is 2 coppers she has not got. And there was a man with a ring of keys who administered the third option and took a fee on it. It did not look like anything grand from where I was standing. It looked like a job with a date on it, and I have done a great many of those. I went and stood in the doorway of the shed until the old man looked up and told him I wanted to talk about the forge. He said the forge was his living and went back to the knife. Behind me, across the dark yard, somebody was still counting sparks out loud, slowly, getting a different number every time and starting again from the beginning without being asked. She came down into the yard at first light with a plan, and she had written it out, and she read it to me off the paper while I was still finding out what my back thought about a stone floor. There were 4 items on it. Sell her winter cloak, which would fetch 8 coppers. Ask her sister Marta for an advance, which would take a fortnight by post and would not come. Apply to the circles for a hardship remission, which was decided by a committee that Proctor Bittern sat on. The 4th was to speak to the instructors about having her scored on the pair rather than on her own casting, and she explained the difference between those 2 things to me twice, and I had taken it in the first time on the west stair the evening before. I said the cloak stays on her back, and that the rest of it takes 29 days we have not got. She said that was fair and then read me the second item again with a new sentence in it about the postal roads. She breathes in the wrong places when she is frightened, so what comes out sounds like a person arguing when it is a person asking. It took me most of a month to hear the difference, and I got it wrong twice in between. We went to the hatch, and the woman said 2 coppers. Nell counted them out. 2 coppers, said the woman again to the empty air above my shoulder, and I ate offal and barley out of a wooden bowl in a yard while 300 children ate meat indoors. It was not bad. I have had worse on a Tuesday off a brazier under a viaduct, and I said so, and Nell looked at me as though I had confessed to something. The lower yard at the circles is where they put the animals that cannot be trusted on the grass. A row of stalls, 40 coppers the month. A water trough with ice at the edges. Midden, a peg for tack, and at the far end, Baz Tuluk's shed with the forge in it going since before anybody currently at that school was born. By the middle of the morning, there were a dozen students in the yard and none of them had come about an animal. "Fetch," said a boy with a badge on his collar, and threw a stick past my ear. I looked at it for a while. Then I looked at him. He had the grace to go slightly pink, but he did not leave, because there were half a dozen people behind him, and one of them was a girl he was interested in. And at 17, that arithmetic beats shame every time. "Roll over," said somebody else. "Speak, breathe fire." 2 of them started a wager about whether I could be got up a tree. A man with 56 coppers to find by the muster does not have a great deal of dignity available to him, and I had already spent most of mine on a stone floor in front of 400 people. I asked what the bet was worth. 4 coppers, said the boy with the badge, when he had stopped being surprised. 4 coppers, if you fetch it. So I fetched the stick. I walked over, picked it up, walked back and put it in his hand, and I did it slowly, and I did not perform any of it. And the laugh they had loaded did not go off because a man walking across a yard is only funny if he is trying not to be. Then I held my hand out and he paid, and the girl he was interested in watched him pay, and that was the last time anybody in that year offered me money to be a dog. 4 coppers, I said to Nell. 56 to go. She said we were not doing that again. I said we were doing whatever was on the table until the bond was posted, and that she could have the argument with me on the 30th day, and she stood there with her mouth open on a sentence she had already prepared, and then shut it. That is the first decision I ever made in front of her instead of at her, and she has never once let me pretend otherwise. Baz Tuluk let me stand in his doorway for the length of a whole pipe before he said one word to me, and I stood there for all of it. Because a man who owns the only fire on a ground has bought the right to finish his smoke. His shed smells of hot iron, cold horn, and burning hair. 22 years in it. He has a hoof knife he sharpens while other people talk, which I took at first for rudeness, and later understood to be the only way a man gets through a working life at a school full of children. 2 coppers a day for the fire, he said. You buy your own charcoal. 6 the sack, and it goes fast, so do not tell me about it afterwards. I said that was fair, and he said he had not finished. You do not touch a hoof, he said. Not a hoof, not a claw sheath, not a foot of any kind on this ground. Feet are mine. I said done. And I meant it, and I kept it for 4 months, and then I broke it without ever once noticing I had. Knocked the pipe out on the anvil and said the thing that made me like him. He said, the boy with the jar sits out there half the night, Somebody should tell him the yard has a door on it. The groom with the burn scar on his wrist came down at noon with his cap in both hands and stood at the end of my bench without saying anything until I put the strap down and looked at him. Tribute had a scale lifted along the barding line, where he had gone down on the flagstones, low on the ribs, a hand's width of it standing proud and packed with grit. The animal would not let anybody near it. The groom had been told to have him sound by the muster, and had been told by Oswin Grail personally, which meant he had been told twice and unpleasantly. I asked what it was worth to him. 6 coppers, he said, out of his own money, and then, in a rush, that he had 12 and could go to 8 if it took the afternoon. 6 is right, I said. Do not ever bid against yourself in front of a man you are hiring. He looked as though nobody had told him anything useful in years. I did not need the forge for it. Grit out, sheath eased with the folding knife, a strip of boiled leather cut to the gap, and a copper rivet cold set through the barding lug so the strap stopped riding on the raw edge. 3 things. It took under an hour. The drake stood for all of it and did not make a sound, and the groom kept saying, "He does not do this. He does not stand for me," and each time he said it, he sounded less pleased about it. It was not affection, and it was not gratitude. He had gone down under a man who did not hit him afterwards, and there are not many hands in that animal's life that have been on him without wanting something out of him. That was the 6th copper of the day, and we were 12 days in. 10 of 60. I said the numbers out loud to Nell because she was doing the sum in her head wrong on purpose in the kind direction. Sim Otley came at the change of the second bell with the jar under one arm and a piece of slate under the other, and he had ruled lines on the slate with the edge of a rule, and the lines were straight. 180 in a minute, he said. Then, before I could answer, he said it was lower this morning, and that was his fault, because he had had a bad night, and 9 goes off when he goes off, and he apologized for that too. I asked him whether he had ever counted it at the same hour 2 days running. He said no. I said, start doing that, and write the hour next to the number, and he went away with a piece of slate held against his chest like a man carrying a warrant. I should be honest about what I thought that jar was worth to me that day. I thought it was worth nothing. I was being kind to a small boy in a big coat, it cost me nothing to do, and I did not think about it again until the frost came. Nell's roommate came down before supper to look at me, which she said straight out, and I liked her immediately, and I was wrong too. Dovie Ashlyn, 16, with a hound at her heels so ordinary that the two of them together looked like a drawing of a girl and a dog. She talks with her mouth full. She laughs before the end of a joke, including her own, which means she is often laughing alone, and does not mind. She had Nell's good boots on. Nell noticed at the same moment I did. I only wore them to the hall, said Dovie. I will get the heels seen to. And Nell said it did not matter, in the voice she uses for things that matter, and Dovie laughed before the end of that as well, and went off to supper with her arm through Nell's. Everything Dovie did to that girl over the next year was exactly that size. Nothing she ever did was worse than a heel. The light was going, and I had a brazing job open on the bench, a split cage plate off a 3rd year's lizard, held in a vise made out of 2 bricks and a strap, because the shed vise was Baz's, and Baz was at his supper. You cannot leave a braze half-made. The joint cools wrong, and you cut it out and start again. And I had bought the flux with 4 of the coppers I had earned being a dog. That is when Hoyt Pemble came into the yard leading a griffin. I knew the wing before I knew the boy. She carried it high and out, the way you carry a thing that has healed against you, and she put her weight down on the near foreleg every stride to keep the shoulder off it. Whoever had said it in a hurry a long time ago. He had a crutch under his arm, not for himself, for her. A padded fork of ash with a leather cup on it, carved and sanded and rubbed with oil, and he had made it, and he was carrying it where I could see it. I saw you with the drake, he said, and everyone saw you with the drake. This is Majesty. She was the 2nd best flyer in her year before. He was 17, and he had a griffin that could not fly, and he had walked her down 2 staircases and across the grounds to stand in front of a man he had watched from a gallery. I had a joint at cherry red and a strap holding the bricks, and about 90 seconds before it went cold. There was an ant on a wall, he said. This was the North Road. I almost saw the royal carriage, and my aunt did see it, and there were 4 horses on it, and the 4th was gray. Come back later, I said. That is all I said. I did not say it cruelly, I did not raise my voice or wave him off, and if you had been standing in the yard, you would have said the man was busy, and you would have been right, and you would have missed it entirely. He heard it. 17 years old, and what he heard was a man pricing a wing as a job and a boy as a cost, and doing the pricing out loud without meaning to. Of course, he said, you are working. I can see you are working. He said it twice more on his way to the gate, in a bright voice, to nobody, once to the hound and once to the wall. Finished the braze. It came out clean and it is still holding, and the 3rd year paid me 9 coppers for it, which took me to 19 of the 60. When I looked up, the yard was empty and the light had gone off the top of the wall. Across the grounds, at the arch by the west stair, there was a lamp and a crowd of about 30 and a boy in white gloves standing in the middle of it with his arms open, holding a quart the way his father holds land. Hoyt Pembley was walking towards it with the crutch under his arm, at the pace of a griffin that cannot go faster. And I watched him go all the way in, and I thought nothing about it whatsoever. Word about the drake went round the school in a day, and word about the lizard plate took a fortnight, and the second one was worth more, because a boy who can throw an animal is a curiosity and a man who can put one back together is a supplier. By the 18th day, I had 31 of the 60 coppers, a bench made of a stall door on 2 barrels, and a queue. The queue was one girl with a lame ferret, and she stood in it anyway, at the end of it, behind nobody. I charged what Baz charged and no less, because the only thing worse than being cheap on a ground like that is being cheap in front of the man whose fire you are renting. Sim came at the same hour every day now with the slate. 206, 194, 240, which was the day they gave out the winter blankets. Sparks per minute, and the hour beside it, in a hand that got neater every week. And Oswin Grail did his kindness in public, and I was 30 paces away, and I watched all of it and did not understand a single thing I was looking at. They had the exercise ring lit at the second bell with lamps up on poles, which is not done for practice, and there were about 90 people round it. That was not an accident either. Somebody had gone to the trouble. Hoyt Pembley had Majesty in the middle of it on a lead rein, and he had brushed her, and he had oiled the crutch. House Grail does not leave a griffin of the circles crippled, said Oswin, to the ring rather than to the boy. My father keeps a surgeon at Cold Harrow who has set the wings of hunting birds worth more than this school. I have sent for him. There is no charge. There is no charge is a sentence that has never once been true in that boy's mouth. He is not a liar. It is simply that he cannot say a thing without pricing it, so when he waves a price, he is still telling you the number. Surgeon came in a coat and took 40 minutes over it, and he broke the wing again at the old join and set it and strapped it, and it was skilled work, and Majesty screamed twice, and the second one went through the crowd. Then she stood up with the wing strapped level and flat for the first time in 3 years, and the ring made a sound like a held breath letting go. Hoyt Pemble cried in front of 90 people and thanked him out loud, by name, twice, and everyone applauded, and there was not one dishonest thing in that boy's face for the whole of it. Nobody in that ring knew the next thing, including the surgeon, and I did not know it either that night. A wing that is carried wrong for 3 years is not a broken wing anymore. Muscle has shortened round the fault, and the shoulder has rebuilt itself to serve the shape it has, and if you straighten the bone and leave the rest of it alone, you have made the animal a promise the rest of her cannot keep. 4 days later, she could not put weight on the near foreleg at all. That was not the surgeon being a fool. He was a good hand, and he did good work. It went wrong because it was done in a lit ring in front of 90 people at the second bell, which is when you do a thing for a crowd, and never once when you do a thing for an animal. I have blamed a good many people for that wing since, in order, and it took me most of a year to get round to the right one. A muster is not a parade. I had assumed a parade, and I had said so to Nell twice in the fortnight before my first one, and she had been too well brought up to correct me about it. Runs from the second bell to dark on the last day of the month, in the big ring behind the west stair, with the whole school on the banks and the instructors on a plank stand and a clerk at a table under an awning, and every pair in every year works in front of all of them and is scored. The work is real. A pair goes in with a task and a beast on the other side of the ring that does not want the task done, and there are stewards with poles who stop it when it wants stopping, and there is a bonesetter's bench under the awning with a bucket beside it, and the bucket is not for show. 3 broken arms went through that bench in my first muster, and one of them belonged to a second year who had been laughing at me in the corridor for a fortnight, and I felt about that exactly what you would expect, and it wore off before the bonesetter had finished with him. Instructor Rosalind Teague runs the ring. 28, a whistle she uses instead of shouting, and she does not repeat herself, which at a school where every child repeats everything is close to a magic trick. She has an empty collar on her belt, plain leather, worn dark at the buckle, the size for something about the mass of a deerhound. She has carried it 4 years. I did not ask that day, and I did not ask for a long time. Get them out, get them up, get them home, she said to the stewards, and that was the whole of her address to the muster. The clerk under the awning would not let Nell be scored at all until he had my species for the pairs list, and he sat there with the pen held up off the paper, waiting for it, while the line behind us got longer. Gave him the trade, and he wrote down artisan, familiar, unclassified. The proctor had written human, unnatural. The exam form said welder. That is 3 officials, 3 entries, and none of them wrong, and I have since collected 11. Nell went an 8th of 12 with nothing but me and a piece of chalk, and the task was a tethered ram elk that had to be moved 4 strides off its ground and held there for a count of 10, and she stood at the line and told me the rules of it 3 times while the ring waited. I moved it in under a minute with a rope, a stall door, and the fence post, because you do not move a thing that weighs 600 pounds, you move where it is standing. That was not clever. That was a Tuesday. The ring did not know what to do with it. There is no applause for a man with a plank. Then the fourth pair went in, and a bank boy's boar took the bank instead of the beast, and it went through the rail and put a splinter of rail through its own shoulder, and it stood in the middle of the ring screaming with 800 people watching and 2 stewards not going near it. Teague whistled once, which meant stop, and nothing stopped, because a boar in that state does not hear a whistle. I went over the rail with the strap off Nell's chalk bag and Baz Tulloch's hoof knife, which I had not asked for, and which he had put in my hand as I went past his shoulder, and that is a thing I have never known how to describe properly. You do not go at the front of a boar, and you do not go at the back. You come along the shoulder on the wounded side, because that side is already carrying pain and will turn away from you instead of into you, and you get the strap round the leg above the wound and take the ground out from under it. It went down. I sat on it. Somebody get me 2 feet of green rail and every belt in the front row, I said. 19 belts came over the rail in about 4 seconds, which is more belts than anybody needs, and one of them had a house crest on the buckle, and I used that one first because it was the longest. We had the splinter out and the leg strapped, and the animal walking before the bone setter had his coat off, and the bank boy stood there holding his own hands and saying, "My father sold that boar's dam," over and over, which was not useful to anybody and was at least honest. Banks came up on their feet, not for me. For the boar, which walked out, and which everyone in that ring had already written off, and that is a much better thing to be on your feet for. Then Teague came down off the plank stand and stood in front of me and looked at the strap and the knife and the state of my forearm. "Whose is he?" she said. "To the ring, not to me." "Mine," said Nell, from the line, in a voice that carried much further than she meant it to. "Score the pair," said Teague to the clerk, and walked back up the steps. And that was the first time anybody at that school put a number next to Nell Ferrow's name that was not the worst one available. 20 silver, said Oswin Grail. He was on the near bank with the gloves, and about 40 people who had come to be near him, and he set it into the gap after the applause, which took timing, and I will give him that much. 20 silver marks for the contract, he said, and I will keep him properly, and you will keep your place. That is a kindness with a number on it, Ferrow. Those are the only ones that mean anything. She had her back to him. She turned round the whole way before she answered, which took about 3 seconds and felt like a great deal longer, and she had chalk on her fingers and blood on her sleeve that was not hers. "He is not for sale. Not at 2 and not at 20, she said. Then she added, because she cannot leave a thing alone, that the contract was registered under her mark, and that a registered contract could not be assigned except by the hand of the master, and that the master was her. She got to the end of all that, and you could hear in the last 4 words that she wished she had stopped after the first sentence and left the rest of it in her mouth. Nobody laughed. That was new, and it was the first thing all year that gave me any idea what the banks were actually going to do with us. The bond table sits at the gate end under the awning, and Bittern sits behind it with the register and a candle, and pairs come up and post, and the ones who cannot post stand to the side and wait to be dealt with after dark, which is a piece of theater nobody at that school has ever bothered to disguise. She put down 48 coppers in 4 stacks of 12. "Regrettably," said Bittern, and turned the keys over twice in his palm, and did not say the rest of it because he did not need to. 5 marks is 60. She was 12 short, and the candle had about an hour in it, and there was nothing left in that yard to sell. I had spent 12 that morning on charcoal for a job I had already been paid for, which is how the trade works, and is also the reason I was standing there with nothing in my pockets in front of a girl who had turned down 20 silver marks an hour earlier. Baz Tulloch came up the line with his apron still on. He put 12 coppers on the table in a single stack, one movement, no ceremony, and said, "Ferrow, 12. And Bittern wrote it, and Baz walked off before anybody could make it into something. He did not look at me on the way past, and he went on not looking at me for the rest of that evening. I understood the money, and I did not understand the not looking, and it took me 4 months and a great deal of damage to work out that I had been standing in his doorway for 18 days taking work out of his hands, and paying him 2 coppers a day for the privilege, and thanking him for it. Nell moved her peg after the muster because the wall is moved by the children themselves, and she went up the stairs to do it, and she came back down, having moved it from 12th to 12th. 9th is where the score put her. The wall goes up at midnight, and it had not gone up yet, and she would not touch it early, and I said she could, and she said it did not count until it counted. So we sat on the step in the cold and waited for a wall to be repainted so that a 16-year-old could move a piece of wood 4 inches. And about an hour into that, Sim Otley came and sat down on the other side of me without saying anything and put the jar between his boots, and the 3 of us watched it fail to make light for a while. Then I paid him a copper for the fortnight of counting. He turned it over twice and put it in his boot instead of his pocket, because a pocket at that school has other people's hands in it, and he said it was the first money he had been given for doing a thing. 261. He said eventually. The letter came the next morning at the same hour as the wall went up, so she moved the peg to 9th with one hand and had the letter in the other, and she read it standing on the stair with about 30 people going past her both ways. Her house had heard about the exam, not the muster, which had happened 12 days after the letter was written. The exam. 200 silver marks a year, paid while she performed. The last payment had gone in at midsummer, and there would not be another one. There was a line at the bottom saying they hoped she would understand, and a line under that with her mother's mark on it and nothing else in the hand of anybody she was related to. She folded it and put it in her coat and said we should go because the ferret girl had come back and was standing in the yard at the end of a queue of nobody. A girl with no allowance at that school does not go hungry. That is the thing people get wrong about it. She eats because tuition is paid to midsummer, and a paid student eats. What she loses is everything under the meals. Stall rent, 40 coppers the month, ink, chalk, which she went through faster than anybody in her year because she draws her rings twice, boots, post, and 2 coppers a day for a familiar at a hatch. She worked it out on the back of the letter with a pencil, which I thought was hard, and then she folded the letter into her coat and kept it there all winter, which I thought was harder. The remission committee sat on the 4th day of the month and refused her on the same afternoon, and the refusal came in a hand I had already learned to read across a yard. Regrettably, said Bittern, when I went up to his room to hear it out of him directly, which he enjoyed. Committee considers means, and it considers conduct, and a summoner whose familiar assaulted a registered drake in the examination hall presents difficulties on the second count. I said the drake came off the tether. The drake, he said, is the property of a house that endows 2 of the 4 hardship places, and turned the ring of keys once in his hand, and coughed his dry little cough, and did not lie so much as stand next to one. Then he explained the latter to me, and he explained it once, because a man who administers a thing that ugly only has to say it once, and it stays said. A bond missed is a bond missed, he said. 2 in a year, and the familiar goes to the block at the muster, and the school recovers what it is owed out of the price, and the balance goes to the summoner. There is a fee of 1 mark on the transfer, payable to the office. Mine is the office. She has missed none, I said. She has missed none, he agreed. And she has posted 1 out of another man's apron. He wrote something in the register and turned it round on the desk so I could see my own entry in it, and the column at the right had a figure in it in his hand. 200 silver marks in pencil with a line under it. Nobody had offered that. Nobody had offered anything near it. He had written it because a number in a register is a thing a house can be shown, and because a man who takes a fee on a price has a reason to write the price up before anybody has said it out loud. I said that a valuation was not an offer. He said, regrettably, that in his experience it very often became one. Then the frost came in on the 10th of the month and stayed, and inside a week it had taken the trade apart underneath me while I was still congratulating myself on having one. Cold is what breaks animals at a school like that. Claw sheaths split. Wing joints stiffen and get flown anyway by children who have a muster coming. Iron goes brittle, and buckles snap, and straps that were fine in autumn come apart in a boy's hands halfway across a yard. So the work tripled, and I could not do it, because every one of those jobs wants heat, and heat wants charcoal, and charcoal went from 6 coppers the sack to 9 in 10 days, and a sack got me through a morning. I was earning 11 coppers a day and burning 9 of them, and I was on Baz's fire for 2 more, and you can do that arithmetic faster than I could because you are not tired. 12 days to the muster, and 44 coppers wanted, and I stood in that shed at the end of a day with a cold joint I had bought twice, and admitted to myself that the trade did not work in winter at the price of fire. Sim came at his hour with the slate, the way he had come at his hour every day for 3 weeks, and stood in the doorway of the shed waiting to be asked because he will not say a number until somebody wants one. 306, he said. Then, worried, because I had not said anything, that it was the cold. 9 likes the cold. 9 is better in the cold, he said. Everything else here is worse in the cold, and 9 is better. And nobody wants a lamp in winter either, so it does not help. I asked him to bring the jar closer to the anvil. I have never once been handed a piece of luck that did not need bending to fit, and the jar was not the exception. It was not a gift. It was a bad lamp that got better in cold weather, held by a boy nobody had ever asked a question. But I had spent 11 years in a trade that runs on exactly one idea, which is that if you can get enough of something small into one place at one time, you can make it do work that nothing that size has any business doing. 300 sparks a minute is 5 a second, and 5 a second is nothing. 300 sparks a minute across a hand's width of copper strap, with the strap taken down to a point, with the jar hooded so that none of them go anywhere else, is not 5 a second anymore. It is one thing, continuously, in one place. It took me 4 nights to find that out, and I ruined the copper twice and burned a hole through my own boot. And Sim sat on an upturned bucket for every hour of it and counted because I needed the rate and because he would not have gone to bed anyway. On the 4th night, the yard was under 2 inches of water off the roof, and there is one floor at that school that is dry stone with iron rings set into it, and it is not in use after dark. So we did it in the summoning hall. That was for the dry stone and the iron rings set into it. And it was also because I had knelt on that floor once in front of 400 people, and a man is allowed a little arithmetic of his own. Nell held the hood, Sim held the jar. I put the strap down on a scrap of stall iron and opened the hood a finger's width. It lit. White, not orange. A white you cannot look at and cannot look away from, and it threw our three shadows up the wall and across the gallery and over the tiers of empty benches, and it made a noise like fat in a pan, and it put a bead through quarter-inch stall iron in about as long as it takes to say so. Sim Otley said a word that a 13-year-old should not know, and then apologized for it, and Nell said nothing at all, and I looked up and the whole hall was lit through the high windows from the inside, which is a thing that hall is not built to do. That is the picture I would keep if I could keep one, not the Drake. Three people in an empty hall at midnight with a white light between them and the shadows going up the wall like a thing being announced. By the time I shut the hood, there were 19 people in the gallery in nightshirts. By the following evening, the queue in the lower yard was 5, and one of them was a school animal, which meant somebody with a key had decided it was cheaper to send it to me than to send it to town. I want to be clear about what the ARC actually did, because a great many people got this wrong afterwards, and one of them wrote it into law. It did not make me able. I could braise before the jar, and I could rivet, and I could work cold, and I had put a lizard plate back together with 2 bricks and a strap and no fire at all. The ARC made me fast. It turned 4 hours into 40 minutes, and it turned 9 coppers of charcoal into nothing, and speed at a price of nothing is the whole of what happened to my trade that winter. The boy is a rate, not a gift. If somebody had taken him away from me that week, I would have been slower and poorer and exactly as good. Instructor Teague came down on the second evening and stood watching a strap job for a quarter of an hour without speaking, with the empty collar hanging off her belt and her hands behind her. "What is that?" she said, meaning the light. I said it was his imp and my copper. She said, "What do I put on the pairs list, Wes?" I said she could put down whatever the last 3 had put down. She said she would put down welding then, and wrote it on her hand rather than on paper, which I did not understand at the time. Then she said, "Does the boy sleep?" And I said, "What? Does the boy sleep?" she said again in exactly the same 4 words at exactly the same speed, and went away up the yard, and I stood there with a strap in my hand feeling as though I had been caught at something without being told what. Verity Roque came on the 4th evening, and stayed the better part of an hour, and stood at the far end of my bench where the light was, and did not ask me for one single thing. 18, final year, tall, a mint leaf in the side of her mouth that she moves when she is thinking. She has a folded rule up her left sleeve, a proper one, brass, 8 inches, and she takes it out to check things nobody checks. Everyone who came that week asked me the same question in one of about 4 ways. What is it, and where is it from? And can you do it to a sword? Can you do my beast on Thursday? She measured the strap. Then she said, "How many minutes of it do you get out of him before the number drops?" I told her the truth, which is that it holds for about 40 and then falls off, and that after 90 it is a lamp again and the boy is gray. "And what does he get?" she said. I said he gets a copper a day and his name on the yard board. She put the rule back up her sleeve and said, "Then your rate is a boy, and your boy is 13, and walked out of the yard. And I stood there for a while being annoyed at her in the way you are annoyed at somebody who has said the thing you were going to get round to. I liked her. That matters later. I'd been at that school 5 weeks, and she was the first person who looked at the work instead of at the light. Dovie Ashland gave the bond date to Oswin Grail in a corridor on the 8th day, and I did not learn it for a month. And when I did, it was not from Nell. I stopped her by the west stair and asked her whether the ferret girl was in her year, which she was not, and then he asked her how she found sharing with Ferrow, and he looked at her the entire time she answered, which is not a thing that happened to Dovie Ashland very often. She talked for a while. Somewhere in it, she said that the bond falls on the last day and that Nell has been counting since the 14th, and she said it the way you hand somebody a cup, and she got nothing for it and was not offered anything. That is all she did. She has never once denied it, and she has never explained it either. On the 20th day, Bidder nailed the auction schedule to the same post as the notice, on the same nail, over the top of it. It listed 4 familiars whose keep was in doubt, with their masters, and the last line under it said that any pair failing a second bond would be called to the block in the ring at the close of the muster, before the banks, and that the office would conduct the sale. Nell read it twice. Then she asked me what a block was, in the sense of whether it was a real object or a way of talking, and I told her I had no idea, and she said she would go and find out, and she went and found out. It is a real object. It is a mounting block with a rail round it, kept behind the awning, and it has been used 11 times in 20 years, and Baz Tulloch could give you the name of every animal that has stood on it because he was the one who walked most of them up. The first man who tried to buy days of me instead of the whole of me came down to the yard in a good coat on the second morning after the light, and he did not haggle, which should have told me more than it did. Steward to House Merivale, out of the Eastern Holdings, 4 hunting drakes and a stable of ridden lizards. 3 silver marks a day, he said, and put a folded paper on my bench under a stone so the wind would not take it while I read. 3 marks is 36 coppers. I had not cleared a mark in a day yet. I read it standing up with a strap still in my hand. The money was on the first line and everything else was underneath it. Exclusive call in the months of frost. Right of first refusal on any work at the circles above 1 mark. and a clause saying I would not decline a task within my competence while under call. I asked him what happened if a task within my competence was a thing I did not want to do. He said that was what the clause was for. I said that was a strange way to hire a man. He said, with no unkindness at all, that they were not hiring a man, they were hiring an availability, and that the difference was the reason for the number. Then he said the other thing, and he said it looking round the shed at the stall door on 2 barrels and the bricks and the strap. There is a smithy standing empty at Merivale, he said. Stone floor, 2 fires, and a door with a lock on it. I have wanted a shop with a door on it since I was 22 years old. It is not a large want. It has never once been about the shop. Nell was standing at the end of the bench with the chalk bag and she had heard all of it, so I did not go away and think about it and come back with a decision, which is the coward's way round, and I have used it before. I said it to her face. I said the money is real, the smithy is real, and the clause means that on the day Bittern calls the block, I would be on a road 40 miles east and unable to refuse a task within my competence. She said then you cannot take it. I said no. She said in a smaller voice that if I took it, she would have 36 coppers a day and no reason to keep me, and that this was arithmetic and not an accusation, and she got that last part out about half a second too late for it to be true. I told the steward no and gave him back his paper, and he took it without any expression at all and said the offer would be improved in the spring, which it was, twice, and worse both times. Baz Tulloch was 4 feet away through the doorway with a rasp in his hand for all of that conversation. 22 years on that ground. 22 years of splits and abscesses and children crying over ponies at midnight, and no house in Wreatham had ever sent a man in a good coat down that yard to put a folded paper under a stone for Baz Tulloch. He said nothing about it. He rasped a hoof for a while, and then he said the frost was going to break Thursday, and it broke Thursday. Instructor Teague came down to the shed at the end of that week with a piece of leather in her hand, and she came at the hour when the yard is empty, which I did not think about at the time and have thought about since. She did not come in. She stood at the shed door where the light was behind her and said, "Buckle." Then she put the collar down on the bench. Plain harness leather, doubled, worn dark on the inside where something had lain against it for years. The buckle tongue had gone at the base. It is the commonest repair there is. Any farrier in the kingdom mends it with a punch and a rivet in 4 minutes and charges a copper. She had carried it 4 years on her own belt and not mended it. I said, "This is a 4-minute job and you have a saddler on the grounds." She said, "I know what it is." And I said, "All right," and did it, and said nothing else. And neither did she. While I was punching it, she said, "His name was Ord." I did not look up because a man who looks up at that moment gets told nothing else for a year. He went down at the pass in the winter of the bad crossing, she said, and I brought the collar back and the school gave me a second summoning, which I have not used, and every year they ask me in the autumn whether I am going to use it. I gave her the collar back with the tongue reset and the strap end skived thin so it would sit flat against a belt instead of standing off it. She turned it over twice and said, "What do I owe you?" And I said a copper, and she paid the copper, and she put the collar back on her belt where it had been and went off up the yard. I have been asked since whether I understood what that was. Of course, I understood what it was. I am 34, and I was married for 4 years to a woman who left me for reasons I have never once been able to argue with. What I did not understand was that I had just become the only person on that ground who could do the one thing she wants, and that she is a woman who bends rules for people who can make an animal work again, and that there is a price on being that person to somebody like her, and that Rosalind Teague pays her prices first and quietly and never mentions them afterwards. Baz knew about Ord. Baz has known about Ord since it happened. I know because a fortnight later, I came into the shed early, and the two of them were standing at the fire with their backs to the door, and he was saying that Ord would have hated the way she runs the muster ring now, all whistle and no shouting, and she was letting him say it. She said he would have hated the whistle most. He said he would have sat down on it. And she made a sound that was not a laugh but was in the same family. And I went back out of that shed and stood in the cold yard for a minute and a half and came in again noisily. That is the only conversation I ever overheard at the circles between two grown people that had nothing whatever to do with me. I have kept it anyway. I could not tell you what for. Sim's numbers became a public service sometime in that fortnight, and nobody decided that it should happen. He chalked the day's rate on the yard board every morning under the Q, 312. 280, 251, which was the morning after somebody had told him his coat was a hand-down, and by noon, 4 separate people had found reasons to be kind to a 13-year-old, and the afternoon count came back at 330. Within a month, there was a yard of grown students and a farrier of 51 managing the feelings of a boy in order to manage the feelings of a jar, and every one of us would have denied it. Tribute began sleeping in my doorway in the second week of the thaw, and nobody invited him, and nobody could work out how to raise the matter with the house that owned him. He is the length of a cart, and the doorway is not. So what he actually does is put the front third of himself inside and leave the rest across the yard where people need to walk. He does not help. He has never once helped. He has been stood on by a girl carrying a bucket and did not wake up. Twice a week a groom came down for him with a lead and apologized to me, and once Oswin came himself and stood at the edge of the yard in the mud in white gloves and would not come any closer and called the animal by name 6 times. Tribute opened one eye and shut it again. "Send him back," said Osmond to me across 30 feet of yard. "He is not mine to send," I said. "He is yours. That is the whole of your case, and I am not arguing with it." He said, "You have done something to him." And I said, "Yes, I took a splinter of rail out of a bore in front of 800 people, and your Drake was on the bank watching," which was not the answer he wanted and had the disadvantage of being true. The muster came at the end of that month, and the banks were fuller than the last one, and about a third of the people on them had come for the ring, and the rest had come for whatever this was going to be. Nell posted the bond in full. 60 coppers in 5 stacks of 12, out of a leather purse she had bought for the purpose with 4 coppers of her own, and Bittern counted it twice and wrote it and said nothing at all, and the not saying anything cost him something. She went in 9th of 12 and came out 4th on the score, and the task was a harness beast that would not take a load, and the pair scored on the load taken, and we took the load in 7 minutes with a spreader I had made out of a broken hayfork. 50 silver, said Oswin Grail. He had the timing again. Straight into the gap. From the bank, in front of the clerk and the stand, and about 900 people. 50 silver marks for the contract, Ferrow, and I will double the boy's keep, and you can have the collar back on a nail for a keepsake. Everything on this ground has a price, and yours has gone up. Congratulations. He is not for sale, she said. Not at 50, not at any figure you have got. And then, because she still cannot leave a sentence where it lies, she said, and if you go on shouting numbers at me across a ring, I am going to start telling people what you paid the surgeon. Which was nothing. There was no charge. He had said so himself in front of 90 people, and half the bank had been there, and about 400 of them worked out in the same second what she had actually accused him of and made a noise about it. It was not a good line. It was better than a good line, because it was the wrong thing said quickly by somebody who had run out of correct things, and the bank took it as a hit and would not give it back. He laughed on the inhale and did not answer, and that was the first installment on a great deal of money. She moved her peg that night from 9th to 6th. She moved it with her sleeve over her hand because the pegs are cold, and she stood in front of the wall afterwards for longer than the moving takes. 6th of 12, she said. Then she said, my sister was 3rd in her year, and went off up the stairs before I could ask her a single thing about that. Hoyt Pemblay was at that muster on the bank with the crutch under his arm, and Majesty lying down behind him, which griffins do not do in a crowd, and he did not come down to the yard, and he did not come near me, and when the banks emptied, he was still sitting there. I saw him. I want that clear. I saw him and I registered it, and I thought, that boy has had bad luck with that animal, and then I went and drank a bowl of something hot because I had been in a ring since the 2nd bell. Lord Rufus Grail came through the lower gate at the 8th bell the next morning, on foot, with one man behind him, and he went past me as though I were a post. He went to the Drake first. He stood in front of Tribute for a while and put a hand flat on the animal's jaw the way you do with a horse you have owned a long time, and he said something to it too low for me to catch. Then he talked to the groom for 6 or 7 minutes, feed, the state of the hocks, whether the barding had been restrapped and by whom. Then he turned round and looked at my bench and at the copper strap and at the boy sitting on the bucket with the jar, and he said the first words he had ever said to me, which were, what does a full set of barding cost me if it is done here? Proper barding for a fighting drake is 3 silver marks anywhere in Reathin, and has been for as long as anybody can remember the number. I told Lord Rufus Grail 4. The extra mark is because his son's animal has a scar along the ribs where a scale lifted, I said, and the plate that sits over it will have to be dished by hand and not bought off a rack, and if I bill you 3, you will get the rack, and it will gall him inside a month. He said, 4 then, and did not blink, and I have priced work for 20 years, and I know what it looks like when a man was expecting 5. Then he stood in the yard for the whole of the fitting, which took most of 2 days, and asked exactly 12 questions, and every one of them was about the animal. Oswin came down on the 2nd afternoon. He stood at the edge of the mud in the gloves with his hands behind him and waited to be spoken to. I have watched a good many men be ignored. There is an ordinary kind, where a busy person forgets you are there, and it is not much of anything, and it mends by dinner. This was the other kind. Rufus Grail knew exactly where his son was standing. He asked the groom about the hocks with his back to him, and he asked me about the strapline, and he asked Sim Otley of all people how long the jar held, and he listened to the answer and said it back to him to check he had it right, and the boy nearly came apart with the honor of it. He never once turned round. When it was done, he counted 4 marks into my hand, coin by coin, 48 coppers, and then he said, I have had 3 letters from this school since midsummer, asking me for 200 marks in silver. I said I had heard the figure. He said, my son writes a good letter. He wanted the money to buy the contract of the man who put his drake on a floor, and he explained in every one of them why it would improve the standing of the house. Then he looked at the barding, and he said, I came to see whether the work was any good, and it is, and that is what I am paying for. He put his glove back on and went up the yard and out the gate, and he did not say goodbye to Oswin, and I do not think he was being cruel. I think it genuinely did not come into his head that there was anybody at that gate to say it to. Oswin stood in the mud for a while after the gate shut. Then he came over to the bench. He asked me what his father had said about him, and I told him the truth, which is that his name had come up once and only in the matter of the letters. Did he ask about the drake? He said. He asked about the hocks and the feed and whether the barding had been restrapped. Did he ask who had trained him? He said. He did not ask that either. Did he ask? He said, and then stopped, because there was nothing smaller left to ask for, and he had got to the bottom of the ladder in 3 rungs in front of a man he had bid 2 silver for on a Tuesday in the autumn. Then he took off 1 glove. I had known that boy 10 weeks, and I had never seen a hand of his. What is underneath is a 17-year-old's hand, with the nails bitten down past the quick on 3 fingers, and he held it out with 2 silver coins in it, the same 2, and said, "Take them. I am owed the transaction." I took them. He was owed the transaction, and it had been owed since the autumn, and I was not going to be the second man in that yard to leave the boy holding something nobody would accept from him. He put the glove back on and went up the yard, and from that day to the end of everything, Oswin Grail never once named a price for a person in my hearing again. He went on naming prices for objects, drakes, duels, and dinners, because that is how he was built, and nobody was going to rebuild him. But not for people. Whatever else he had learned one thing that spring from watching his father pay a welder in a muddy yard, and he learned it the hard way. That is the only way anybody learns anything at that age. 2 days after that, Sim Otley came into the shed at an hour that was not his hour, without the jar, and stood there until I asked him what. "The griffin cannot get up," he said. White Pemble had been carrying Majesty's front end off the straw, with a strap under her chest twice a day for 11 days, on his own, in a stall at the far end of the upper yard, and had not told one single person at that school. He had told Sim. He had told Sim because Sim was the only other person on that ground who was worth nothing. And because 6 days earlier, Hoyt had found him sitting on a step in the wet with the jar and had walked him down to the shed and got him inside where the fire was, which is a thing I had never thought to do in 5 weeks of taking that boy's light. I went up. I want to be accurate about the order of what happened next, because I have made myself sound better than I was about this once already, to Nell on a night when I was tired. I did not go up out of conscience. I went up because Sim asked me and because it was raining and there was no work in the yard. The wing had been set straight and the muscle round the old fault had spent 3 years learning a different shape, and when the bone came true, the shoulder had nothing to hold against. She had torn something across the front of the chest, carrying herself on the foreleg to keep the weight off it, and then torn it again getting up, and then stopped getting up. There was nothing wrong with the wing. The wing was the only sound thing on her. Hoyt had the crutch propped against the wall where he could see it. He had oiled it again. He was on his knees in the straw with a strap in his hands, and he had the sleeves of his good coat pushed up because his working one was wet. I said, "How long have you been doing this on your own?" He said, "Since the 6th. Then he said, "She is better in the mornings." Then he said, "She is not better in the mornings," and put the strap down. Nobody had asked him a direct question in 11 days. That is what came apart, not the animal. I built her a chest frame over the next 4 days, boiled leather and light iron, a yoke across the breast to take the load off the torn side, a sling seat, and all of it hung off a padded band so she carries on bone and not on muscle. It is ugly and it works. She has walked on it for a year. She will not fly again. She was never going to fly again after the second setting, and probably not after the first. And if I had put my hands on that shoulder in the autumn, when a boy stood in my yard holding a crutch he had carved, I would have been able to tell him that in about 90 seconds, and he would have had the whole winter to get used to it instead of doing it alone in a stall. Baz asked me why I had not looked at her in the autumn. He asked it the way he asks things, which is at an anvil, without turning round. I said I had been busy. He let that stand for about 4 strokes of the rasp, and then said, "You were busy in the spring as well, Wes." So I told him. I said I did not want to sit through the story about the carriage. He said, "Ah." That was all he said. Then he said, "The ash for that crutch came out of my woodpile," and he asked me for the loan of a draw knife, and I told him where it was and let him get on with it. I have had worse conversations about worse things. That one cost me nothing at the time and everything about 4 months later, which is roughly how long it takes for a debt like that to come out of the ground. On the 5th day, Hoyt walked her out of the stall on the frame with the crutch under his own arm, out of habit, because there was nowhere to put it down. Half the upper yard came out to look. She went the length of the yard and back, slowly, at a griffin's walk, with her head up, and the wing folded flat against her side where it had not folded flat in 3 years. Then Hoyt Pemble said, "I nearly saw the royal carriage once, and this time, nobody was leaving, and nobody had anywhere else to be, and I had a chest frame that had just come off a bench and I was too tired to move." So he told it, the whole of it. He was 11. His aunt took him up on the North Road wall at Cold Harrow because word had gone round that the carriage was coming through to the crossing, and they waited from noon. It came at dusk. 4 horses, and the 4th was gray, and the lamps were already lit on it, and Hoyt was looking the other way at a man selling nuts. His aunt saw it. He did not. He heard it go past behind him and turned round in time to see the back of it going away down the road with the lamps swinging. That is the ending of the story. That is why nobody has ever heard the ending of that story, because it has taken him 6 years to work out that the ending is that he missed it, and everybody who ever cut him off had been doing him a kindness they did not know they were doing. Then they went home and his aunt bought him a pie. He looked around the yard and his ears were red, and about 40 people stood there with absolutely nothing to say, and Sim Otley said, "What kind of pie?" "Mutton," said Hoyt. "That is a bad story," said a girl from the 3rd year kindly, and Hoyt said, "I know," and laughed until he had to sit down on the mounting step, and that was the first laugh anybody at that school ever had with Hoyt Pemble instead of at him. He tells it 4 times a year now. It has not got shorter. The Concord clerk arrived at the end of that week with a satchel and a letter of authority and an entirely open mind. That was the trouble. Concord is what the summoners of Rethin call the body that keeps the roll, licenses the schools, rules on disputed bindings, and collects a levy on every registered pair in the kingdom. It has an office in the capital with a hall and a permanent circle in it, and until that spring, I had never heard of it. The clerk had been sent because a valuation had been entered against a familiar on the Cold Harrow roll, and the office could not process a valuation against a species that did not exist in the schedule. I did not have to guess who had entered the valuation. It was in pencil, with a line under it, in a hand I could read across a yard. The clerk asked me to state the species. I told him the trade. He wrote it down and then crossed it out. He tried human and crossed that out, and asked whether I had been summoned or had simply arrived, and I told him I could not say, and he wrote unascertained and looked pleased with it. Then he asked me the question that went to the capital. He said, "When the contract ends, where do you go?" I said I did not know that either. He wrote for a while. Then he said, in the tone of a man who has found an interesting bird, that the schedule assumed a familiar returns whence it came, and that the levy is calculated on the assumption of return, and that in a case with no whence there was nothing to calculate against. He said the office would have to rule on it, and that a ruling meant a legate, and that a legate would come out from the capital in his own time. The letter came a fortnight later. It gave a name and a season and nothing else, and Nell read it on the stair and asked me what a legate was, and I said I had never heard the word, and she said she would go and find out. Legate Corvin Sallow of the Concord. Expected at Cold Harrow before the turn of the year. The 3rd muster was the one where the pencil figure came out of the register and stood up in the ring with a coat on. He was a factor for a northern house, sent down with a letter of credit, and he did not shout it from a bank like a boy. He waited until the scoring was done and then walked across the ring to where Nell was standing with a chalk bag and set it to her face, quietly, with his hat off. 200 silver marks for the contract, he said. Paid on the day. The house will settle her fees at the circles to the end of her schooling as a separate matter, and there is no obligation attached to that second part. That is a better offer than anybody had made, and it was made properly, and the man who made it was not enjoying himself, and about 200 people were close enough to hear it. She had her back against the rail. "He is not for sale," she told him, and the factor said, "That was not the question," and she said, "It was the answer," and he put his hat back on and thanked her and went, and she stood there afterwards shaking, because 200 marks was the exact number on the letter in her coat. I said nothing to her about it that night, and she said nothing to me, and Sim chalked 340 on the board in the morning, which is the highest he ever recorded, and none of us worked out why until much later. Instructor Teague came to the shed 2 days after that and stood in the door and did not want to be there, and I had never seen her want to be anywhere less. "There is a woman in Cold Harrow called Hesper Doone," she said. "She paid for my schooling when I was 12. She wants to see you, and I have to be the one who says so, and I want it on the record with you that I have said it badly on purpose." I asked what she wanted me for. Teague said, "Her dog." Then she said, "That is not the whole of it, and you are old enough to hear the rest from her," and she walked off up the yard without another word. Hesper Doone's house sits at the bottom of the mill road with a walled garden and a green door, and she is a widow with money out of charcoal and 14 grandchildren she describes as a fleet. She is deaf on one side. She sat me on her left and made me repeat everything twice for the first 10 minutes, and then, having got what she wanted out of watching a man be patient, she turned her head round and heard perfectly for the rest of the afternoon. "You do that to everybody," I said. "Everybody who comes here wanting something," she said. "It saves a great deal of time. Sit down, you are blocking my light." The warhound is called Belle, 14 years old, a brindle bitch the size of a pony, and the hips have gone and she cannot get up off a flat floor on her own anymore. Doone has been lifting her twice a day for the best part of a year, and Doone is 68, and neither of those two facts had been said out loud in that house before I said them. I built Belle a floor. That is all it was. A shallow ramp of oak battens screwed down over the flags with cross cleats every hand's width, so a dog with bad hips has something to push against instead of a stone floor she slides on, and a sling on a pulley off the beam for the mornings when the ramp is not enough. Took a day and a half and cost 13 coppers in timber, and I charged her 9 and she paid me 12 and told me not to be tiresome about it. When it was done, she sat and watched the dog get up on her own 3 times in a row, and then she stopped watching the dog and looked at me instead, and I knew what was coming a full minute before it came. There is a coach house at the back of this property, she said. Stone floor, 2 fires, one of them wants a new lintel, a door with a lock on it, and there is only 1 key. I did not say anything. I do not want a servant, she said. I want a tenant who is a nuisance. My husband agreed with me for 30 years and then died, and my grandchildren agree with me. And the girl who does the fires agrees with me. And I have not lost an argument since the year of the flood, and I am starting to think I was never right in the first place. I asked what the rent was. She said, 1 mark the month, which is a third of what that building is worth, and I told her so. And she said, yes, and I know that, and I am buying something with the difference, and you know exactly what it is. I did not say yes, and I did not say no. What I said on the walk back up the mill road with the light going was nothing at all for about a mile, and Rosalind Teague walked the whole mile beside me without filling it. Almost nobody alive can do that. At the school gate, she said one sentence about it. She said, whatever you decide, decide it in front of the girl. So I did. I have got a number of things wrong in 2 years, but I did that one properly, and it is the only reason what happened 4 months later did not finish the 2 of us for good. I told Nell in the yard, with Baz 40 feet away at the anvil and Sim on the bucket, because a thing said with witnesses is a thing you cannot take back in the corridor afterwards. I said, there is a coach house in Cold Harrow with a stone floor and 2 fires, and the rent is a mark and the lease would be in my name, and there is a door on it with 1 key, and I have wanted a shop with a lock on it since I was 22, and I had never had one. She said, take it. She said it fast. That was the tell, and then she said it again slower to cover the fast one. Take it. You would be a mile away. You would still be my familiar. The contract does not say where you sleep, it says who feeds you, and if you are feeding yourself, then that is the same thing, except better. And she said the arithmetic out loud, because she cannot stop, and the arithmetic was that the bond is 5 marks a month and a tenant with a stone floor and 2 fires earns 5 marks in a week, and that she had been keeping me at a loss since the autumn, and everybody knew it. I said that if I took a lease in Cold Harrow, the office would have grounds to say the familiar was not housed by the summoner, and Bittern would have the transfer opened inside a fortnight. She said that was not true. It was true. She had not read that clause of the schedule, and I had, because I had gone up and read the whole of it one night when I could not sleep. As Tulloch said, from the anvil, without turning round, that it was true, and that he had watched it done to a girl with a marsh cat in the year of the bad crossing, and then he went back to work and let the 2 of us sit in it. That is where it should have ended, and it did not, because I was tired, and because I had wanted that door for 12 years. And I said the second thing. I said, she is offering me a floor and a fire and a lock, and you are offering me a stall and a bond you cannot post, and I would like somebody to explain to me which of us is being kept. Nell said, all right. She picked up the chalk bag and went up the yard, and Sim Otley looked at the ground, and Baz put the rasp down on the anvil hard enough to make a noise, which is as close as that man comes to shouting at anybody. I did not take the lease, and not taking it was not a virtue. I did not take it because Bittern would have used it, and if Bittern had not existed, I would have been in that coach house inside a week. Verity Roque had been in the yard 4 evenings out of 7 for a fortnight by then, and she never once asked me to do a job, and she never once asked me for anything at all. She watched. She stood at the far end of the bench out of the light with the mint leaf in the corner of her mouth, and she went away when the work went away, and she wrote nothing down in front of me, not once, in 3 weeks. She bought her charcoal off Ordish, who is the carter who brings it up the mill road on a Thursday, at 6 coppers the sack, which is what I paid, from the same man, on the same day of the week. I noticed that at the time, and thought it was a coincidence about charcoal, which tells you precisely how much attention I was paying that spring. On the 5th evening, she asked me the question that got her everything, and she asked it at the end of the work rather than at the start of it, when a man has his hands empty and is pleased with himself. She said, when you put a brace on an animal that fights it off, what are you actually doing differently from the man in town who puts a brace on an animal that fights it off? Nobody had asked me about the work in 2 months. Children asked about the light, and grooms asked about the light, and a Concord clerk had asked me where I went when the contract ended, and one girl in a final year asked me what I did that a saddler in Cold Harrow does not. So I told her. All of it for about 2 hours, with the strap in my hands and the pieces on the bench. I told her that a brace fails at the edge and not in the middle, and that the edge is where it meets a moving animal, and that this is why every piece I make is fitted to the beast in front of me, with the beast standing there. I told her that boiled leather takes a shape once, and iron takes a shape whenever you like, and which of the 2 you want depends entirely on whether the thing underneath is going to change over the next month. I told her that the ark is a rate and not a gift, and that Sim is 13, and that if the boy has a bad morning, the light does too, and I told her the number that the light stops holding at, which is 90 minutes. And I told her the one that mattered, which was that I make every piece a one-off because I have never once had 2 animals with the same fault, and that it is slow, and that I know it is slow, and that I have not worked out what to do about it. She put the mint leaf out of her mouth into her palm and folded it and put it in her pocket, which is the only fidget that woman has, and she thanked me, and she meant it. And she went. I felt better that night than I had felt in a month. That is the ugly bit, and I will not dress it. Somebody had finally looked at the work instead of the light, and I had been alone in that shed with my own hands since the autumn, and a person who understood what I was doing was worth more to me at that moment than a lease with a lock on it. Vanity. Plain, ordinary vanity of the kind that does not feel like vanity at all while it is happening, because it comes dressed as the pleasure of being understood. 10 days later, there was a second yard on that ground, and I heard about it from the ferret girl, who assumed I already knew, and was embarrassed for about a minute when she worked out that I did not. It is on the far side of the upper stables, where the old muck store was, and she had swept it and roofed half of it and put a bench in it, and Baz was not surprised, and Sim did not understand, and Nell went and looked at it and came back and said nothing. There was a board on the gatepost with 3 braces hanging off it on 3 nails, and under each nail a word burnt into the wood. Small, middling, large. 3 sizes. Made ahead of time, made to nothing in particular, hanging on a nail waiting for an animal, and any fool could see they would fit worse than mine, and any fool could also see that a girl could walk in there at noon and walk out at 4 minutes past with a brace on her ferret. I stood at that gate for a while, looking at the 3 of them swinging on their nails, and I did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not about money. It was that on the far side of that yard, hung on a hook by the bench where a customer would see it, there was a hood and a copper strap and a jar with nothing in it. Rosalind Teague told me exactly what was going to happen to me, in one sitting, in about 4 minutes at the end of a day in the 2nd week of spring, and I heard every word of it and did nothing whatever with any of them. She came to the shed with a copy of the Concord schedule under her arm and put it on the bench open at a page and said, "This is what a legate does, and it is not what you think. He does not decide your case," she said. "He cannot. The office rules on classes and not on persons, so the only thing he is able to hand down is a rule, and a rule is a sentence that applies to everybody it fits, including people who have not happened yet." I said that was to my advantage, since at the moment I was nothing on any schedule, and any rule would be better than none. She said, "Yes, and that is what everybody says," and then she closed the book and put it back under her arm and said, "Come to the muster on the last day. All of it. Be seen there. Be in the ring with her, and be scored, because the legate reads the pair's lists before he reads anything else." I said I would. Hesper Doone's coach house has a chimney breast that was built by somebody who did not care, and the lintel over the second fire had been carrying a load it was never cut for since before I was born, and it had opened a crack the width of a copper across the underside. I had told her I would do the fire before the least question got answered either way, because a woman of 68 who lifts a 14-year-old dog twice a day should not also be sleeping under that lintel. She had said, "And if I have the work done, and you still say no about the tenancy," and I had said, "then you will have a sound chimney, and I will have wasted 4 days," and she had said, "That is the first honest answer I have had in this house since the flood." So I put a new lintel in on the last 3 days of the month. You cannot do that job in stages. You strike the old one out from underneath a standing chimney breast on props, and until the new stone is bedded and the load is back on it, you have a wall standing on 2 lengths of pine and a promise. The props went in on the morning of the muster, and the new stone would not seat, because the seat had spalled behind the old lintel where nobody could see it, and it took me until the 11th hour of that night to cut it back and bed it and get the weight off the pine. I have gone through the arithmetic on that day 100 times, and it comes out the same every time. If I had walked away at noon and gone back at dawn, that chimney would probably have stood, and probably is the word a man uses when he wants to leave. But there is the other arithmetic, which is that I could have started the lintel a fortnight earlier, and did not, because a fortnight earlier I was in a shed on school ground doing work for people who paid me in coppers. And I chose Doone's job for the week that had a muster in it, because Doone's job came with a stone floor and a door with 1 key on it. Nell went into the ring on her own. A pair is scored on the pair. The task that month was a hobbled marsh cat to be got out of a crate and onto a scale, which is a 2-person job, and everyone in that ring knew it, and she stood at the line and did not ask for a delay and did not say where I was. She got the crate open. She got a strap on it, she got it 4 feet, and it went over her and put her on her back in the sand in front of the banks. And the stewards came in and got the cat and got her up, and she stood there with sand down one side of her and blood coming out of her nose and asked to be scored anyway. They scored her. 11th of 12. Then she climbed the west stair with her nose still bleeding and moved her own peg down 5 places with her own hand, which is the rule, and by every account I have been given, she did not make one sound while she was doing it. I was under a chimney breast in Cold Harrow, 40 minutes away, with a stone half bedded and 2 props under a wall. Instructor Teague signed the pair's list at the 9th bell and wrote me present. She did it in her own hand in front of the clerk, and the clerk knew, and bidder knew by the following afternoon, and the school pays its instructors a stipend on the 15th of the month, and hers did not come. A month of it. 4 marks and 4. It is not a fortune, and she is not poor, and I found out much later that she sends most of that money to a house in the Fen country where her mother is kept, and that she sent it that month anyway out of what she had, and ate at the refectory for 4 weeks like a first year. Nobody told me. That is what I keep coming back to. She did not tell me, Bittern did not tell me because he was saving it, and Nell did not tell me because Nell had decided sometime in that fortnight that she was not going to be a person who reported things to me. I heard it from Dovey Ashland 3 weeks later in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely, in exactly the tone you would use for the weather. Ivory Grail came onto the grounds on the second day of that spring, in a plain gray coat, with one servant, and she did not go and look at the yard, and she did not come to the shed, and she did not ask about me at all. 19. A folding fan she uses indoors in cold weather, which is not for the heat. It is so that she has a reason to stop talking in the middle of a sentence. She came to be a 4th year, having done 3 at a school in the capital, and inside a fortnight she had the sort of standing at Cold Harrow that her brother had spent 3 years buying with drakes and dinners. And she did it without once raising her voice or paying for anything. She met Nell at the peg wall in the first week. I have this from 2 people who were on the stair. You are the one who summoned the man, she said. Nell said yes. Ivory looked at the wall for a while and said, 11th. And then she said, you were 6th in the winter, which was not a thing anybody would know unless they had gone and asked. And Nell said yes. And Ivory said, then that is worse than being 12th all along, and folded the fan. She was not sneering. She was agreeing with the wall. That is the whole trick of that woman, and it took me half a year to see it. She says the true thing that everybody has been kind enough not to say, and she says it with sympathy, and it goes in further than any insult would because you cannot argue with it. Then she said, I do not want him. I want your place. I am telling you now so that you do not spend the spring wondering. She went to Bittern in the same fortnight, and I was not there, and I have the shape of it from a man who was, which is the porter who sits outside that office and who has heard 20 years of it and is not asked about it enough. She did not offer him money. She asked him whether the house on the river at the mill end had gone yet, the one with the walled yard on it, and he said it had not. And she said her family held the ground rents on that whole side and that leases came up for renewal in the autumn and were not always renewed at the asking price. That was all of it. She never said a number and she never made an offer, and there is nothing in that conversation a court could look at. And from that afternoon, Anselm Bittern belonged to Ivory Grail as completely as a coat belongs to a peg. He has wanted that house 9 years. He can tell you the asking price without stopping to think, and a walled yard is the point of it because the man keeps 4 dogs in a set of rooms above the proctor's stair and has done since before any of us were born. I went to Teague when I found out about the stipend. It took me 2 days to get her a loan because she arranged for it to take 2 days. I said I would make it good. She said no. I said it was my debt and not hers, and that I had the money. She said, you do not owe me 4 marks. Then she said, you owe me a muster, and you have already not paid it, and that account is shut. I said I was sorry, which is a poor coin and the only one I had, and she said, I know, and started walking, and then she stopped about 4 paces on and turned round and gave me the only unguarded sentence I ever got from her. She said, I have spent 4 years arranging my life so that nothing depends on me being anywhere. Do not make me start again, Wes. Then she went, and the muster roster for the following month went up on the instructor's board 3 days later with a different name against the ring. And she was down for stores and the pairs list, and she did not run a ring again until the autumn. The yard thinned across those weeks, and it did not thin the way I expected. I had expected an argument. What actually happens is that a girl who used to come on a Tuesday comes on a Thursday instead, and then does not come. And when you see her at the hatch, she's perfectly friendly and says, her ferret is much better. And it is, because there is a middling brace on it off a nail. Q went from 9 to 5 to 3. Sim chalked the sparks up every morning under a Q with 3 names on it and then 2, and he stopped writing the Q on the board without being told to, and just wrote the number. Baz Tulloch's Q did not thin at all because Verity Roque does not do feet, and I noticed that and thought it was luck. On the last evening of that month, I came round the corner of the stable block, and Nell was standing in the middle of her own yard in the dark with nobody in it, not working, not waiting for anybody, with her arms folded, looking at the bench. I asked her what she was doing out there. She said, I am seeing what it looks like. And I said, what does it look like? And she said, it looks like the autumn, and went in. As Tulloch told me himself, standing up, in his own shed, at the beginning of the day rather than the end of it, which is how a man tells you a thing he has decided he is not ashamed of. Roque has offered me a place, he said. 3 marks the month, feet only, no bench work, and I keep my own hours, and I go across on the 1st of next. I said, 3 marks. He said, 3 marks, and then he waited because he is 51, and he knew exactly what I was going to say next, and he was giving me the room to say it. What I said was, you have the fire here. And he said, I have the fire here, and I have had the fire here for 22 years, and it has never once had a wage attached to it. Then he said the rest of it, and he said it without heat. That was worse. He said, you have been in my doorway since the autumn. You pay me 2 coppers a day for my own charcoal fire, and you have taken about a third of my living out of that door in your 2 hands. I have not said a word about it because I like you and because it was not your fault and because you did not know. I said that was true. He said, no, you did not. And in 8 months, it has never once come into your head to say, Baz, come and work the bench with me, and we will split it. Because I am 51, and I hold a hoof knife, and you are 34, and you hold a strap, and a man does not look sideways at somebody he has quietly put out of business. Then he said, that girl asked me on a Tuesday. She had a figure ready. She had thought about what I do rather than about what she needs, and she offered me feet, which is the one thing on this ground that is mine, and she did not once call it a favor. I had nothing. I stood in that shed and I had nothing at all, because every single word of it was true, and I had known most of it for months in the way you know a noise in a wall. I said I would match it. He said, no, you will not, and you cannot, and if you could, it would be worse, because then it would be charity paid in a panic on a morning, and we would both have to live with the way it was got. I asked him whether it was about the 12 coppers, put the pipe in and took it out again and said, no. Then he said, it was never the 12 coppers. It was the not looking up afterwards. He went across on the first. He took the hoof knife and the leather strop and the draw knife and left the anvil and the fire because those belonged to the school. And he swept the shed out before he went, which I did not ask him to do and which I have not got over. Ivory Grail recruited Dovey Ashland properly, with terms, in a corridor, in about 10 minutes. And I have all of it because Dovey herself told me a year afterwards and did not soften one word. Ivory did not flatter her. That is what Dovey has never got over. She said, you talk too much, and everybody knows it, and it is not a fault. It is simply a thing you do, and it means people tell you things because you are safe to leave a sentence with. I would like the things you are told. I am not going to pretend that is a compliment. Then she said, and I know what you want because it is written on you. You are never going back to that farm. Not for a season, not for a week, not for a funeral. Dovey said she did not know what she meant. Ivory said, my mother keeps 4 households, and one of them is in the capital, and it has a place in it for a girl who can be pleasant to strangers. It is not a large place. It is a permanent one, and it is in a city, and it is 300 miles from a farm. That is not flattery, and it is not blackmail. It is a wage, offered honestly, for a thing that is genuinely worth having, to somebody who has wanted one specific escape since she was 12. And Dovey Ashland said yes inside a minute, and has never claimed otherwise. She told me later that being bought properly was the worst thing that ever happened to her, because Oswin had got the bond date out of her for nothing at all with one look, and at least when Ivory did it, she had the dignity of a price. Nell learned about the bond date in the last week of that month, from the ferret girl, who had it from a boy in the 3rd year, who had been on the stair when Oswin said something about a last day. She did not have it out with Dovey. She came down to the yard and sat on the step by the trough for about an hour, and then went back up to a room with 2 beds in it and 1 candle, and they went on sharing it until midsummer, and neither of them ever said a word about it out loud. I asked her once why she did not have it out. She said, because then I would be 16 and alone in a room, and Dovey talks to me at night, and I would like to have got something out of this year. Verity Roque had tribute in her yard by the end of that fortnight. Oswin Grail had stopped coming near me sometime after the 2 coins, and the animal still slept in my doorway most nights, and there was nothing anybody could do about that. But the barding and the strap work went across the upper stables to the girl with the 3 sizes, and I do not blame him for a second. Her large brace is a good piece. I have said so since, and I said so at the time to Sim, who did not want to hear it. It is boiled leather over light iron, well made, and it will fit about 7 drakes out of 10. Tribute is not 7 out of 10. He has a scar the width of my hand along the near ribs where a scale lifted on a flagstone floor in the autumn, and the tissue under it is thin, and it will not carry a strap. I know that because I dished a plate by hand to sit over it in the winter, and Lord Rufus Grail paid me 4 marks for the doing of it, and the plate is still in the tack room at Cold Harrow with my rivet in it. The muster came round on the last day. Nell went out to her own yard at first light and stood in it, and there was nobody in it, and there had been nobody in it for a fortnight. She had one job on the board, which was the ferret again, and the ferret girl had come back because she had come to like sitting on the bench and talking, and not because there was anything wrong with the ferret. Nell went into the ring 5th of 12 and scored 9th and did it clean, and the peg went from 11th to 9th, and that is not nothing. Tribute went in at the 8th turn with a large brace on him and a boy of 15 on the rein, in a task that wanted the animal turned hard twice inside a rope corridor. It came apart on the 2nd turn. The strap rode up off the plate seat and onto the scar, because a brace made to a size does not know where a scar is, and a drake with a hand's width of raw meat under a moving strap does not stop and think about it. He went through the corridor, he took the rope and 2 posts and about 6 feet of the bank rail, and the boy came off him at the 2nd post and went under the rail on his face, and the animal came round in a full circle in loose sand with a strap tightening on him at every stride. There were 200 children on that bank inside the arc of him. I did not decide anything. I want that understood because I have been given credit for a decision I did not make. A man who has spent his working life on high steel does not decide. He is over a rail and moving before the thought arrives, and the thought, when it arrives, is usually a complaint. I came in on the wounded side, which is the side everybody tells you not to, because a beast turns away from the pain and not into it, and I got the buckle. The whole of it was one buckle. The strap came off in my hand, and the Drake went 4 more strides and stopped and stood there shaking. I sat down in the sand next to him, because my legs had arrived at their own opinion about the last few seconds, and Tribute put his nose on the burnt place on my glove and left it there, and about 900 people saw that happen, and made a noise I have never heard a crowd make before or since. Verity Roque was 15 feet away with a fitting bag in her hand, and she did not move. She has said since that she froze. I do not think she froze. I think she is the only other person in that ring who understood in the first second exactly why the strap had ridden. And I think what she was doing in those 11 seconds was arithmetic. And I think she got the answer before I got the buckle. Afterwards, in the sand, with the boy being carried out on a hurdle and the Drake being led away by a groom with a burn scar, I took the large brace off the ground and turned it over and put my thumb on the seat where the leather runs out. Then I cut the seat back 3 fingers with a knife off a steward, and I punched 2 holes and set a copper rivet through into a folded pad, and I gave it to her. I told her that it now had a relief in it, and that any Drake and Wreathen with a rib scar could wear it, and that she should cut every large one she had the same way tonight. She said, "Thank you." That is the whole of the conversation. She said, "Thank you," and she took it, and she went, and I have never once held that against her, because I had given her everything else in an evening in the spring for free, and this was only the last of it. Nobody in that ring thanked me either, and I do not mean the crowd. The crowd went out of its mind. I mean that no person came up to me afterwards and said a word about it, because the pair whose animal it was had a father who does not speak to people, and a brother who was standing at the top of the bank with his gloves on, saying absolutely nothing. Nell found me at the rail. She had sand on her from her own turn, and blood on my sleeve that was not mine again, and she looked at me for a while and then said, "You have got to stop doing that in front of me." I said I would try. She said, "No, you will not." The legate came through the main gate the following morning at the 8th bell in a plain coach with the Concord seal on the door, and 1 clerk, and no escort, and he did not send word ahead, and he did not go to the master of the school. He came down to the lower yard, alone, in a black coat, an old man with a flat, quiet face, and he stood at the gatepost and looked at the empty bench and the swept shed and the boy on the bucket with the jar for a while before anybody noticed he was there. Then he said, "Good morning. Would you state the species?" Legate Corvin Sallow stayed 11 days and asked, by my count, about 40 questions, and he already had the answer to 38 of them before he opened his mouth. That is his method, and he does not hide it. He asks a thing he knows, and then he stops, and he lets the silence run until the person in front of him improves on the truth out of sheer discomfort, and then he writes down the improvement. He is not cruel. I want to be fair to him because a great deal of what came after was his doing, and none of it was malice. He is a tired official within a year of a pension who has ruled on 900 disputed bindings and would like the last of them to be simple. He interviewed Bittern for an hour and a half and came out with the register under his arm, and the pencil valuation was still in it. And Bittern coughed his dry cough 4 times in the corridor afterwards. He interviewed Nell for a quarter of an hour, and she over-explained the contract to him 3 separate times, and he let her do it. And at the end he said, "Thank you, that was clear," which is the only unnecessary kindness I ever saw out of that man. He interviewed Sim Otley for most of an afternoon about the jar. I was not in the room. Sim came out of it walking about a foot off the ground because a man from the Capitol in a black coat had asked a 13-year-old to explain his own work and had written the answers down and had asked whether the numbers on the slate were kept in a book anywhere. "No," Sim said. "They should be," said the legate, and wrote that down too. Then he went to the refectory hatch and asked the woman with the ladle whether a human familiar was 1 meal or 2. "2 coppers," she said. "That was not what I asked you," he said. "2 coppers," she said. He wrote something down, and by the next morning there was a line in the school ledger that has never been settled from that day to this, because what he wrote was that the matter was determined by local practice. The hearing was in the summoning hall on the 9th day, and there was no need for it to be in the summoning hall. He chose it. He had the clerk set a table on the floor by the chalk, with the tiers going up on 3 sides and 400 students in them, because Corvin Sallow has been doing this for 40 years, and he knows what a room does to an argument, and he wanted the argument to be short. I stood roughly where I had landed. That was not lost on me, and I do not think it was lost on him either. He put 4 questions, and he put them slowly, and between each one he waited, and the waiting was the worst of it, because a hall that size fills a silence with its own noise, and the noise gets into your head. "Were you summoned?" he said. "A ring was drawn and a working was done, and I arrived in the middle of it," I said. "Past that I cannot tell you anything. There was rain and a bridge deck, and then there was stone." "Did you consent?" he said. "No," I said. Then he did the waiting at me, and I had watched him do it to Bittern for an hour and a half, so I stood there and let it go by, and after a while he wrote, "Have you been fed and housed by the summoner in accordance with the binding?" he said. She fed me on the first day out of the last coppers she had, I said, and I have fed myself since. If you want to call that a failure of the contract, there are about a dozen people in this room who would like a word with you outside. Somebody in the gallery laughed. He waited for it to finish and then waited about 4 seconds longer, which put a stop to any more of that for the rest of the morning. Then he asked the fourth question, the one he had come 300 miles for and the one he already had in front of him. When the binding ends, he said, "Where do you go?" I said I did not know. "That is what I have here from the clerk," he said. "I would like you to say it again in front of the school." So I said it again. It went up into the tiers, and there was not one sound anywhere in that hall. Then he sat for a while with his hands on the table and looked at the chalk on the floor, which had been redrawn a dozen times since the autumn by children who were now in that gallery watching a man in a black coat decide what somebody was. Verity Roque gave evidence for 20 minutes on standard practice in beast fitting at the office's own request, because the clerk had gone round the grounds asking who could describe the work in general terms rather than in particular ones. Nobody else could. I could not. Ask me about a brace, and I will tell you about the animal it is on, and ask Baz Tulloch about a hoof, and he will tell you about the horse, and that is the whole of our trade, and it is also the reason neither of us has ever been of the slightest use to an institution. She stood up with the folded rule out of her sleeve and described 3 sizes, and the tolerances of each, and the fitting time of each, and what proportion of animals at a school of that size each would serve. She had numbers. She had them in a book. She had been keeping the book since the evening in the spring when a man in a shed told her everything he knew for free, and she had never once written a word of it down in front of him. Sallow asked her one question. He asked whether the method required the man. She said no. She said any competent hand could make the 3 sizes and any competent hand could fit them, and that the fitting was the skilled work and the fitting could be taught in a season, and that the only thing that could not be taught was the light, and the light was a summoned imp, and there were imps. She sat down. She did not look at me. She has never once claimed she was doing anything other than answering the question she was asked, and that is true. And it is also the most complete piece of work I have ever watched anybody do. He gave the ruling on the 11th day, in the same hall, standing up off a single sheet in about 90 seconds. The office holds that a familiar is defined by the function it performs under a binding, and not by the species of the thing bound. A human familiar is therefore a familiar. It carries the full protections of keep and housing. It may not be assigned, transferred, or sold except by the summoner's own hand and mark. It may hold property, take a wage, and stand as a witness. Where no place of return exists, the binding is held to be permanent until dissolved by the summoner. Then he folded the sheet and said, "That is the finding," and sat down, and the hall came apart. They carried me. 400 children carried a 34-year-old structural welder up the tiers of a summoning hall on their shoulders. For the first few seconds of it, I hated it. After that, I did not hate it at all, and there is no telling of this where I come out of that sentence well. Nell got up on the clerk's table because she is a foot too short to see over anybody, and she was shouting something nobody could hear, and Sim Otley was crying, and Hoyt Pemble was telling somebody about the royal carriage, and out in the yard somebody had got a barrel open before the legate had reached his coach. The refectory woman gave me a student's meal that evening and charged 2 coppers for it, which is the only concession that Hatch has ever made, and it was never repeated. Rosalind Teague came and stood next to me at the edge of it with her hands behind her, and did not say congratulations. She said, "He wrote a rule, Wes." I said, "I know." She said, "No, you do not," and went to bed. I lay in the shed that night with the whole school still going in the upper yard, and I worked it out at about the 3rd hour, which is 2 hours after Verity Roque worked it out, and 11 days after Rosalind Teague told me it was coming. A finding on a person is a finding. It ends when the person does. A definition is a different animal entirely. A definition is a hole with a shape, and the shape of the hole he had just cut was this. A human familiar exists. It is lawful. It carries protections, which means the office is obliged to administer it, which means the office must have a procedure for it. And the office had, sitting in its own transcript, a description of that procedure in 3 sizes, with tolerances, with fitting times, given under oath by a final year student who wanted passage money out of Rethin. I had spent 8 months proving in public that a man is worth more to a school than a beast is. I had done it in front of 400 witnesses, over and over, on purpose, because every time I did it, a girl got to keep her peg on a wall. Nobody had asked what would happen when somebody believed me. I went out into the yard at about the 4th hour and sat on the mounting step in the dark, and tribute was across the doorway, and up the hill I could hear a school that had spent the evening celebrating on my behalf. There was nothing to do about it, and that is what I kept arriving at. No man to hit, and no rope to cut. A tired official had written a true sentence on a sheet of paper and gone to bed, and the true sentence was mine, because I had spent the year making it true in front of him. The clerk posted the schedule on the 4th day after the legate left, on the board outside the master's stair in a fair round hand, and the whole school went and read it because everybody was still pleased. It set out the classification. It set out the protections in 12 lines. It set out the form of registration and the fee for entering a binding of the new class on the roll. 6 silver marks, payable to the office by the summoner at registration. Nell read it twice, the way she reads everything, and then she said the thing that neither of us had said out loud yet, and she said it in the flat voice, which is the frightened one. She said, "Why would they set a fee for a thing that has only ever happened once?" The second one happened on the 14th of midsummer, in the same hall, on the same floor, and it took the office 3 months from the posting of the fee to the drawing of the ring. Her name was Corrence Yule, and she was 14, and her father sat on the board of a shipping house at Yarrow, and what she had asked for, out loud, to the proctor in front of her mother, was a swan. Her father paid 6 silver marks to the office and had the binding registered in the new class before the working was done, which is the part of it that nobody at that school had thought possible until they watched it happen. You do not register a thing you have not caught, and nobody registers a wolf in advance. A class exists to be filled though, and a fee exists to be paid. And once there is a form with a line on it, a man with money will fill the line and then go and get the thing that fits it. I stood in the gallery for that one. I did not want to, and Nell would not let me not. The gallery was full, and the gallery was laughing before anything had happened, the way it laughs at every summoning. And the ring took about 10 minutes, and then there was a woman on the floor in a green quilted coat with a canvas bag over her shoulder, 41 years old, 5'2", wet through, holding a lamp with a battery in it that ran for another 6 days and has been in a case in the capital ever since. Her name is Angie Fred. She is a plumber, out of a city that is not on any map of Rethan and is about 300 years down the road from it, and she had been standing in a stairwell doing a survey when the floor stopped being a floor. She was not frightened. I have thought about that a great deal, because I was frightened and I had a working life of being outdoors on steel behind me, and she had a clipboard. She looked round the hall for about 4 seconds. Then she looked up at 400 laughing children, and then at the proctor coming down the steps with his keys. And she said the first words spoken by a summoned human being at the circles other than the word welder. She said, "Who is responsible for this building?" Bittern said, regrettably. She said, "No, I am asking you a direct question. Who is responsible for this building? Because there is water coming through that wall at the 3rd course, and it is coming through in a line. And a line means it is running along something. And if you have a lead run in a wall of this age, then you have a lead run with no fall on it, and you have had for years." The hall stopped laughing, not out of respect, out of pure confusion, because 400 children who had come to watch a girl get a swan were now listening to a small wet woman in a green coat conduct a survey. She got about 6 minutes. She did the east wall, and she did the gutter line off the roof, and she did the drain in the yard that everybody at that school has stepped over since it was built. And she told the proctor of the Cold Harrow School of Summoning that his east wall had a decade in it at the outside, and that she would want a proper look before committing to that. Then she turned round and saw the girl. Corrence Yule was 14 and standing in her own chalk with both hands over her mouth, and her mother was on her feet in the 2nd tier, and there was a form on the clerk's table with 6 marks already paid against it. I would like to record that somebody handled that moment well. Nobody did. Not the office, not the school, not me. And I was standing in the gallery with the best information in the room, and I stayed in the gallery for another minute and a half. What actually stopped it was Angie Fred looking at a 14-year-old's face and saying, "All right, love. Nobody is shouting at you." And then, to the hall, at volume, "Could somebody get this child a chair?" Got down there eventually. We had about 2 hours in the lower yard that evening, and most of it was her asking questions in an order I recognized, which was the order you ask them in when you are working out whether a structure is coming down tonight or in 10 years. When I got to the contract itself, she stopped me and made me say it twice. She said, "So I am legally a piece of equipment belonging to a child." I said, "The finding says protections of keep and housing, standing to hold property, and a wage." She said, "That is what equipment gets in a good yard." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Right," and sat down on a barrel and swore steadily for about 40 seconds, without once repeating herself, which I have not managed since, and I have tried. Then she said, "And who wrote it?" I said, "A man called Sallow wrote it." She said, "No. Somebody put it in front of him, and somebody made it easy, because nobody writes a rule that tidy on his own." And I said her name, and Angie Fred said, "And where is she now?" And I said the capital, and Angie Fred said, "Of course she is." They took 9 on the 2nd day of the following month. It was done properly, with a paper, by 2 men from the office who were polite the entire time, and who had nothing to do with any of it. The schedule of the new classification lists the light as an element of the procedure, and the levy applies to any summoned creature employed in a registered procedure, and an unregistered imp employed in a registered procedure becomes a matter for the office. The paper said impoundment pending assessment. Sim Otley was in the yard when they came, and he did not argue with them, because he is 13, and he has never argued with anybody in his life, and he handed the jar over with both hands and then said sorry to the man who took it. He did not cry in the yard. He went up to the shed and sat behind the anvil where the wall comes round, which is where a boy goes when he does not want to be seen. He was there 4 hours, and I let him be there because I did not know what else to do, and because I was busy being angry. 2 nights later, the yoke on Majesty's chest frame opened at the near weld. It had carried a griffin for the better part of a year, and I had made it in 4 days with an arc and no proper jig, and metal that has been bent cold and welded hot without a stress relief will find that out eventually, and it found it out at the worst hour of the worst week. Hoyt had been carrying her front end again. 3 days, he said, when I got it out of him, and he said it in a bright voice, and I said, Hoyt, and he said, 4. There is no ark without the jar. There is no forge without Baz Tulloch, who was across the grounds in a yard belonging to somebody else, and would have come if I had asked him, and I did not ask him. So I did it the way I did it before there was ever a jar in that yard. I cut the failed yoke out with a hacksaw blade in a frame at 10 at night. I made the new yoke out of 2 lengths of flat bar off a stall door, cold, over the horn of an anvil, with a hammer, which takes about 10 times as long and leaves your hands unable to hold a cup. Then I drilled it. Then I riveted it. 31 rivets, hot set out of a brazier of charcoal I bought off Ordish at the gate at midnight for a mark. A rivet is stronger than a weld in a joint that flexes, which is a thing every bridge in my old life is held together by, and which I had stopped bothering to remember. I finished at the 9th hour of the morning. It took 11 hours, and it would have taken 40 minutes with the light, and the frame I made that night is the one she is wearing now, and it is never opened. The arc was never the ability, and that night is where it got proved, with a hacksaw blade and 31 rivets. It needed proving. There was a version of me about 3 months off believing that my own 2 hands ran on a 13-year-old. Sim came down at the 7th hour and stood in the door and watched me set rivets for 2 hours without saying anything. And at about the 8th, he came and held the bar for me because a rivet wants 2 hands and a bucking iron, and I had been using my knee. He said, "It is faster with 9. I said, "It is faster with 9. It is not better with 9, and you should know the difference, because there are going to be people who tell you the difference does not exist." He thought about that for a while. Then he said, "Can I have him back?" I said, "I do not know," and that is the only honest answer I had, and it is also the first time I ever told that boy a true thing that did not help him. Marta Farrow's letter came in the same week, in answer to one Nell had written at midsummer and had not told me she had written. It was a page and a half. It was not cruel. There was a great deal in it about a house at Ashcroft and a husband's people and the difficulty of the roads in the wet months, and there was a line saying that their mother had been unwell in the spring, and there was one sentence about the muster. The sentence said that Marta had heard about the man, and that she hoped Nell was being careful, and that people talk. Nell read it on the stair. Then she folded it into her coat with the other one, and she has kept the 2 of them together in that coat for as long as I have known her, and she went down to the yard and did 4 hours of work on a bench with nobody in the queue. I asked her at the end of it whether she wanted me to say anything about the letter. She said no. Then she said she did not ask me to come home. Then she said, which is not the same as being told not to, and picked the strap up again. The notice came out of the Capitol on the last day of that month, and it was not sent to us. It was posted at every school on the roll, and a copy came up the mill road on Ordish's cart with the charcoal. The Concord had voted funds for a permanent circle in the hall of its own office in the Capitol, iron set into stone to stand open, maintained by the office for the registration and execution of bindings of the new class. There were 3 of them, small, middling, and large. The middle of that autumn, I had been 11 weeks without the light, 9 without Baz Tulloch, and about 4 without a night that ran the whole way through. Everything took the old time again. A brace that had been 40 minutes was 4 hours. A frame that had been an afternoon was 2 days of cold work with a hammer, and my right hand had started closing on its own in the mornings and taking a while to be talked out of it. The queue was 3, then 2, and 2 of the 3 had come out of loyalty, and there is nothing on this earth heavier to lift than a customer who is standing in your yard as a kindness. I was eating at the hatch on Nell's 2 coppers again. That had not happened since the winter. She never mentioned it, and she paid it every day, and every day I stood at that shelf and watched a 16-year-old count out 2 coppers she had earned by copying out registers for the clerk at a copper an hour. That is the ground the next thing grew in, and none of it is an excuse, and I have not once offered it as one to her. There were 3 boys in the yard on the 9th morning, second years. They had come down to look at the man from the ruling, because the ruling had made me a thing people came down to look at, and they had been there about a quarter of an hour asking whether it was true that I had thrown a drake. One of them asked what I got paid. I said, nothing this week. He asked, in the way a 15-year-old asks whether it was true that the school fed me, and I said no, and he asked who did. And I said, I am kept by a child who cannot feed me, and the office has made that lawful, so we are all very pleased. That is it. 18 words on a cold morning to 3 boys whose names I did not know and have never learned. And I said it because I was tired, and because it was funny, and because there was nobody in that yard I was trying to be anything for. Nell was behind the anvil where the wall comes round. She had been there since before the boys came. It is the place Sim sits, and she had taken to sitting there in the mornings with the register copying on her knees, because it is out of the wind and because the shed is warmer than anywhere else on that ground, and I knew that, and I had forgotten it for 10 seconds. She did not come out. She waited until the boys had gone, and I had gone up to the stores, and then she went up the hill, and I did not know she had heard it for another 2 days. She did with those 2 days was go and read the schedule properly, all of it in the master's copy, and then go to Anselm Bittern's room and ask him what a transfer required. She did not go to him crying. I want that understood because Bittern has told the story since with her crying in it. She went with the clause numbers written on a piece of paper in her own hand. Regrettably, he said, and then, having established that he could not resist it, he told her, a transfer requires a receiving house of standing, an instrument of assignment, the master's own hand and mark on it, and a sitting of the office at which the master states in person that the assignment is voluntary. There is a fee of 1 mark. She asked which houses had standing, and he named 4. One of them was House Grail. She asked him whether House Grail would keep a familiar properly, and he said that House Grail kept 40 animals and a surgeon and a stone tack room with a stove in it, and that a man of my trade in that house would have a bench, a fire, a wage, and a bed, and that he would never in his life stand at a hatch again for 2 coppers. Every word of that was true. That is the whole trouble with Anselm Bittern, and it is why he has lasted 22 years. He does not need to lie. He simply tells you the true thing that pays him. She signed the instrument that afternoon. I found out from Ivory Grail, who came down to the yard for the first time in her life to tell me, in a plain gray coat with the fan folded in her hand, and who did not enjoy it, which somehow made it worse. She said, "Your girl has assigned you to my mother's house. It was lodged this morning. I thought you would rather hear it from somebody who has no reason to soften it." I said that was not possible without the master's hand. She said, "It has the master's hand on it." Then she said, "I do not want you. I have never wanted you, but I am not going to pretend this does not suit me, because when that instrument goes through, she will be a summoner with no familiar in the middle of a school year, and there is only one place on that wall for a girl like that, and it is the bottom one." Then she said the accurate thing, because she cannot help it either. She said, "She did it for you. You should know that before you go up there and be careful what you do with it." I went up there. Of course I went up there. I got her out of a corridor with about 40 people in it, and we had it out on the west stair under the peg wall, which was the worst possible place, and neither of us chose it. I said, "Take it back." She said no. I said she had signed me over to a house whose son had bid 2 silver for me on a floor in the autumn, and she said, "And his father paid you 4 marks in the spring and said your work was good, and I have thought about which of those 2 is the house." I said it was not her decision to make. She said, "It is the only decision I am allowed to make. That is what the finding says. Read it. It says you cannot be assigned except by my hand. And every single person in this kingdom has read that as a protection for you, and not one of them has noticed it, means the only person who can ever do anything about your life is me." Then she said the rest of it, and she said it without her voice going anywhere, and she had clearly had it ready for 2 days. She said, "Wes, you are 34 years old, and you sleep on straw in a stall, and you eat offal on my 2 coppers, and your hand does not open in the mornings. I have watched it. You put it under your arm and you walk round the yard until it opens and you think nobody sees you." She said, "I cannot feed you. You said so yourself, and you were right, and it is not an insult. It is a fact I have failed at for a year. I said I had been tired and that I should not have said it." She said, "You meant it." And then, and this is the sentence I have never got out from under, she said, "You have never once said a thing you did not mean. It is the only thing about you I would swear to in a court, and it is the reason I believed it. I could not undo it. That is the shape of it, and it is why it belongs in this account rather than in some kinder one. The instrument came off by the master's hand, or it did not come off at all. I could not withdraw it. Teague could not withdraw it. Hesper Doone could not have bought it back with the whole of the mill road. There was one person in Wreathen who could stop it, and she had signed it because she loved me and was 16. She withdrew it at the sitting of the office, in the ring, at the muster, in front of the school. Bittern arranged for it to be there. He had the right to hold the sitting in his own room with 3 witnesses, and he chose the awning at the muster instead, with the banks full, because the fee is payable either way, and because a proctor who is quietly owned by a 19-year-old had been given a use for the afternoon. She had to stand at the table and state out loud in her own words that the assignment she had lodged was withdrawn. Then she had to answer the office's questions, and the office asks too. It asks whether the withdrawal is voluntary, and it asks whether the summoner is presently able to maintain the familiar in accordance with the binding. She said no. She said no in front of 900 people into an afternoon with no wind in it. She said, "I am not presently able, and I am not going to say I am, and I am withdrawing it anyway." Bittern asked her, for the record, on what grounds. She said, "On the grounds that he is not for sale, and I have said that in this ring 4 times now. And I did not stop meaning it because I got tired." Cost her everything the exam had cost and more, because the exam had been an accident, and this was a thing she had done herself, twice in public, in opposite directions. The banks did not laugh. I have gone back over that afternoon and I cannot find a laugh in it anywhere. What they did was much worse, which was to go completely quiet and look at their hands, because there is nothing on this earth more uncomfortable than watching somebody young be brave in a way that is not going to work. I stood 4 feet behind her the entire time, with my hands where everybody could see them, and I did not say one word, because the one thing I could have done was speak, and the one thing that would have finished her was a grown man answering for her at that table. That is the entire account of what I did to help. I stood there. I have been thanked for it since, and I have never been able to take it. Afterwards, she went up the west stair and moved her peg from 9th to 12th with her own hand, because a summoner who declares she cannot maintain goes to the bottom of the wall, and that is in the schedule, and Bittern had the clerk read it out. Ivory Grail moved hers to 1st the same evening. She did it quietly and without looking at anybody, and she has never once mentioned it in my hearing. And Anselm Bittern took his fee of 1 mark on the withdrawal, which is the same fee as on the assignment, because the schedule sets it against the instrument and not against the outcome, and he wrote it into the register in front of both of us and turned the book round so we could see it. 12 coppers. He had made 12 coppers out of the worst afternoon of that girl's life, and he did not gloat about it, and he did not need to, and he coughed his dry little cough and put the keys away. Baz Tulloch was on the far bank the entire time with his arms folded in another yard's apron, watching that table, and he did not come down and he did not go home either. Quarrel between Baz Tulloch and Anselm Bittern began 22 years ago over where a cart could stand. There is a strip of cobble behind the lower stable, out of the wind, wide enough for one vehicle. Baz's charcoal comes in on it. Bittern's dogs go out on it, 4 of them, in a covered cart, twice a week, to a piece of ground by the river that he does not own, and walks them on anyway. In the first year of both their employments, there was a morning on which each of them found the other one there, and words were said, and the proctor's office issued a note about the use of the yard, and the note came down on the side of the office. Neither man has forgotten a single thing about it. I have had the account from Baz twice, and it has never varied by a word, including the weather. It was not at the muster where it finished. I have that on my conscience in the sense that I would have liked to see it, and on my record in the sense that it is the cleanest thing that happened at that school all year, and I had nothing whatsoever to do with it. I have 3 accounts of it, and they do not agree about anything except the middle, and the middle is enough. His second year called Pell had lost his keep bond twice, and his marsh cat went to the block at the close, which is the 11th time that block has been used in 20 years, and Baz Tulloch walked it up, because Baz Tulloch has walked all 11. The sale went through at 4 marks to a factor for a house at Yarrow. The office takes 1 mark on the transfer, which is written and posted and read out. Then everybody went to the gate, because a purchased animal walks out at the gate, and at the gate the Yarrow man put a second coin into Bittern's hand. Baz was holding the rope. He was a yard away, and he was holding the rope, as he had been at the gate for every one of the other 10. He said, "That is 2. Bittern said, regrettably, "This is a matter of the office." And Baz said, "No. That is 2 coins, and I have stood at this gate holding a rope 11 times, and I have seen 2 coins go into that hand 11 times, and I have written every one of them down." Then he took a daybook out of his apron. A farrier writes everything down. Every foot he touches, the date, the animal, the owner, what it cost. Because a farrier who cannot say what he did to a horse 2 years ago is a farrier who ends up in a room with a lawyer. Baz Tulloch has kept a daybook since he was 30, and he has 40 of them in a box under a bed. He had them all with him. He did not bring 1 book. He brought all 40 in a sack at a muster, which means he had brought a sack of 40-day books to a public occasion on the chance of a second coin, and had probably brought it before, and had certainly brought it more than once. He read out 11 dates. Then he read out the amounts, which came to 19 silver marks and 4. And then he said the sentence that finished it, which was that on 4 of those 11, the second coin had come out of the money the office was holding for the summoner, and not from the buyer at all, from the balance owed to a child. That is what did it. Nobody at that school cared very much about a factor giving a proctor a coin at a gate. That is how half the trade in Rethin has always worked, and every person on those banks knew it. 4 children had been shortchanged on the price of their own animals, and 2 of those 4 were still at the school, and 1 of them was standing 10 feet away. The banks came off the banks. There were stewards in it inside a minute, and Instructor Teague had her whistle going, and there is a version of that afternoon, told by a boy in the 4th year, in which Anselm Bittern went over the gate rail into the mud. He did not go over the rail. He walked to his own room with 2 stewards, and the books went to the master's office, and the office of the Concord had a letter about it inside a week, and he was gone by the turn of the year with no pension and no character. He did not get the house on the river. That is the thing about that man that has stayed with me longest. 9 years of small cuts, 19 marks and 4 all told, and the house at the mill end was 140, and he was never within a lifetime of it at the rate he was going, and he must have known. Baz Tulloch went back to his own shed that evening and had his supper and did not speak to anybody about it. And when people came to tell him what he had done, he said it was about the cobbles, which was a lie, and which he has never once withdrawn. Ivory Grail got her peg to the top of that wall in the autumn and kept it there until the year ended, and she did it entirely on merit, and nobody at that school has ever suggested otherwise. Her mother's letter came in the same month. I know about it because Dovey Ashlyn was in the room when she opened it, and Dovey Ashlyn tells people things, which is the whole of her character and the sum of her trouble. It was 4 lines. It said that they had heard she was doing well. It said that the gray coat was a good choice, and that plain suited her. It said her aunt had asked after her and had remarked how well she had looked at midsummer. 3 of the 4 lines were about how she looked. Ivory did not say anything about it. She folded it up and put it in the fire and then went and sat her 4th-year examinations and came first in 3 of them. She stopped using the fan indoors after that, and she started eating in the refectory instead of having a tray sent, and she took the table nearest the servery where the light is bad and nobody sits, which is as close as that woman was ever going to get to the servants' table she actually wanted. Dovey Ashlyn came back across in the last week of the autumn, and she did not announce it, and there was no scene. What happened is that she stopped going to Ivory's rooms in the evening and started being in her own room again. And one morning she came down to the lower yard with her hound and sat on the step by the forge and did not offer to help with anything, and was there again the next day. On about the 4th day she said, to nobody in particular, that she had told Osmond Grail the bond date in the autumn and that she had got nothing for it. Nell said she knew. Dovey said, I know you know. And Nell said, all right. And that is the entire conversation those two ever had about it. And they shared a room for 2 more years. I asked Dovey once, much later, why she came back, and I expected something about friendship, and I did not get it. She said, Ivory paid me. Then she said, that means there is a price on me, and it can be beaten, and everybody in that household knows what it is, and I would be that girl for the rest of my life. Then she said, Nell has never offered me anything, and started laughing before the end of it. That is what she does. Baz Tulloch came back to the bench on the first day of the winter, and he named his own terms, and he named them standing up in the middle of the yard with about a dozen people listening. He said, feet are mine as before, and they are mine in writing this time. He said, half of the bench work by the piece, and I take the pricing on anything with a foot in it. He said, my name goes on the gate above yours because I was here first. And he said that last one with a completely straight face, and he meant it, and it is there now. Then he said the only thing in the whole of it that was not a term. He said, I did not come back because you asked. You never asked. I came back because that woman standing over there stood up at a table in front of 900 people and said a thing that was going to cost her, and then paid it. And I have worked at this school for 22 years, and I have not seen anybody do that before. He said, why did you leave then, if it was never about the money? He said, it was about the money. Both things are true, and if you cannot hold 2 of them at once, you are going to have a long life at this school. Verity Roque had left Cold Harrow at the end of the summer with her final year completed and a letter of introduction from the office, and had a room in the Capitol by the autumn, and was working out of the Concord's own hall 3 days a week on a retainer. Nobody at Cold Harrow found that shocking. What we knew of it came through Ordish the carter and through the notice board, and it read as a girl from a small school doing extremely well, and it was. Sim Otley got 9 back in the 2nd week of the winter with a paper and an apology and no explanation. Paper said assessment concluded, subject released to registered holder, and there was a second sheet with it that nobody had meant him to see, and it was a valuation, and it valued a spark imp of that rate at 10 silver marks with a note that the office held 4 of similar class. 4? They had gone and got 4. That is the only line on either of those 2 pages that mattered, and it took me 2 days to notice it, because I was busy being pleased for a 13-year-old. The quarter list came out of the Capitol in the last week of the year, posted at every school on the roll, and brought up from the Capitol on the charcoal cart the way everything comes to Cold Harrow. It listed the bindings of the new class registered in the previous quarter, by school, with the summoner's name and the date of the working and the fee paid. 31 of them, 19 at the Concord's own hall in the Capitol in the last 6 weeks alone since the iron went into the floor. At the bottom there was a line about the next quarter and a date in the spring, and a note that the office would sit in continuous session for the whole of that week, and that the hall would be open to the public, and that seats in the gallery might be reserved through the office at 2 coppers. The Concord Hall in the Capitol is 12 days from Cold Harrow on the Carrier's Road, and 4 if you are somebody, and Hesper Doone put us on a private coach for the entire distance and would not discuss the money. Nell came. I did not want her to come, and I said so once, and she pointed out that a familiar cannot travel out of his school district without his summoner's mark on a paper, and that I could therefore have her company or a great deal of correspondence. Angie Frett met us at the yard of the Bell and Anchor with a list. She had been in the Capitol 10 weeks by then, giving evidence about drains to a committee that had no idea what to do with her. And she had discovered in that time the one thing about Rethen that nobody born in it had ever noticed, which is that if you speak to an official in a completely level voice about a subject he does not understand, he will keep giving you appointments. She had the register. She had the 31, and the 9 more since, and every name and school and date, and she had it because she had walked into the office and asked the clerk for it, and the clerk had given it to her. The hall itself is the largest room I have ever stood in, and it is built to be looked into rather than to be used. The circle is at the center on a raised floor of gray stone, and there are 3 of them concentric iron bar set flush into cut channels, small inside, middling inside large, and the iron is a hand's width across and about a hand deep, and it is bedded on lead. They had done it properly. Whoever laid that iron knew his trade. There is not a scarf joint in the whole of the large ring. It is drawn and forged in 6 segments with the joins pinned and set. And standing on that floor with my hands in my pockets, I could have told you the name of every operation on it and roughly what each one cost. That was the first moment I understood that the thing I was going to have to do was going to take a night. The gallery runs on 3 sides, and it seats about 600, and it was full, at 2 coppers, and there were people selling hot chestnuts on the steps outside. And I am putting it down because everybody afterwards described the atmosphere as solemn, and it was not solemn. It was a fair. That is what it was. There were 40 people in that gallery who had come the way you come to a hanging or a launching, and there were children in it, and somebody had a dog. Legate Corvin Sallow sat at the office table for the whole week because the schedule says a legate presides, and he had presided over 19 of them in 6 weeks, and he had the flat, quiet face on, and I could not read one single thing behind it. I had asked for one thing through the office, and it had taken Angie Fret 3 days of level speaking to get it. It was not a hearing, and it was not a challenge. I asked for leave to speak to each registered summoner in the hall about the terms of dissolution, on the grounds that, as the first of the class, I had an interest in how the class was administered. There is nothing in the schedule that permits that. There is also nothing in the schedule that forbids it, and Corvin Sallow is a man who has spent 40 years standing on exactly that distinction, and he granted it in 11 words without looking up. So on the 4th day of that week, they brought the registered pairs into the hall and stood them along the east wall in the order of the register, and I walked the line. 41 of them by then. The masters were children, because that is who is at a summoning school. The youngest was 9, the oldest was 17, and behind every child, in the front row of the gallery, in good coats, were the people who had paid the 6 marks. What I said to each of them was the same, and it was 11 words long. I said, "You can end this today with your own hand and mark." And I said what it meant, which took longer, and I said it to the child and not to the row behind. And I said it slowly enough that the gallery could hear every word of it, because the gallery was the only part of that room I had any hope with. 9 of them released. 9 children out of 41 put their own mark on a dissolution at a table in front of their parents, and 4 of those 9 were crying, and 2 of them were crying because their parents were standing up. It is the best thing I have ever been in a room for, and it was not enough, and it stopped being the best thing about 10 minutes later, because a man called Hob Verity, a cooper of about 50 who had been pulled through at Ashcroft in the 2nd week and released that morning by a boy who did it the moment it was offered, walked out of the east door into the yard and stood there. No place of return exists. The binding is permanent. That is my finding, and those are the words I stood up in a summoning hall and made true. Dissolve it, and the binding ends. The man is free. He is also, at that moment, standing in a yard, in a city 300 miles from a school he did not choose, with no name on any roll, no trade license, no house, no return, and no coin, and the office has no procedure for him whatsoever, because a released familiar is not a class, and nobody had written a fee for it. 9 men and women walked out of that hall free, and by dusk, 7 of them had come back to the steps, and the office had them fed out of the levy that night as an administrative discretion, and that is the sentence I have never been able to get out of my head. Administrative discretion. Corvin Sallow wrote that himself, in his own hand, on his own authority, and it is the only unlawful thing that man has ever done in 40 years, and he did it so that 7 people could have supper. The boy who would not release was called Tam Ollery, and he was 11, and he refused on grounds so poor that the whole yard was still arguing about them at nightfall. His familiar was a woman of about 30 from a fishing town, and she had been there 5 weeks, and she wanted to go, and she said so out loud, and the boy said no. He said no because she had promised to teach him to swim. That is all of it. She had said it in the 2nd week, in a kitchen, the way you say a thing to a frightened child. And Tam Ollery cannot swim, and his father cannot swim, and his grandfather went into the Yarrow at the crossing 12 years ago, and the boy stood at that table and said a promise is a promise, and would not be moved off it by anybody. The gallery went at it for about a quarter of an hour. There were grown people in that hall arguing about whether an 11-year-old was entitled to hold a woman to a swimming lesson. About half of them said he was, and one man at the back shouted that a promise made under a binding is not a promise at all, and about 80 people told him to sit down. What ended it was the woman. Her name is Cass Marrow, and she went and squatted down in front of him in the middle of the Concord Hall and said, "If I teach you, will you sign it?" He said yes. She said, "Today." He said, "There is nowhere to swim." She said, "There is a river outside this building, and it is the 4th of the month, and I have been in colder." And she took an 11-year-old boy out of the Concord Hall in front of 600 people and taught him to float in the Yarrow at 4 in the afternoon, and he signed the dissolution on the bank with a borrowed pen and wet hair. I have never in my life seen anything better done. I did not do it, I could not have thought of it, and the 2 people who did it were a fisherwoman and a child. The one who would not be released at all was named Bettany Orne, and she was about my own age, and she had been a night nurse in a hospital in a city with electric light in it. Her summoner is a girl of 9 called Sabby Wren, whose family are not rich, and who had been given the 6 marks by a grandmother who thought she was buying the child a friend. I put it to her twice. I put it to her the 2nd time badly, because by then it was the 5th day, and I had 9 released and 7 of them on the office steps, and I said something about not being obliged to be grateful. She heard me out. Then she said, You have not asked me one question about her. I said, all right, and asked. She said, that child brings me my dinner before she eats her own. She has done it every night for 6 weeks, and she does not know I have noticed, because she thinks I do not know what time the refectory shuts. She is 9. Nobody taught her that. Then she said the rest of it in a completely flat voice, and it is the only speech I heard in that entire year that would not have been improved by leaving something out of it. She said, I have been a night nurse for 19 years. I have looked after 400 people who could not look after themselves, and I was very good at it, and nobody ever once looked after me. I am not staying because I am bound. I am staying because for the first time since I was 22, somebody in the building is watching whether I have eaten. She said, you want to make it so that nobody can be brought here, Wes. Do that. I will help you do that, but do not stand in front of me and tell me that the answer to my life is a piece of paper that puts me in the yard with the Coopers. I did not have anything to say to that, and I still do not. Corvin Sallow closed the session on the 6th day and read out the figures because the schedule says the figures are read. 41 registered in the quarter, 9 dissolved. 246 marks taken in fees, of which the greater part goes to the maintenance of the hall and the circle, which is a stone floor with iron in it that has to be swept and pointed and kept. And he said that the office would sit again in the same hall at the same time in the following quarter, and that the register was open, and that the fee was unchanged, and he put the cap on his pen. Angie Frett said, out loud from the 4th row, in a completely level voice, that his east wall had 10 years in it. I stood on that gray floor for a long time after the hall emptied, with a lamp on my knees, going round the large ring with a rule, and my hand flat on the iron, finding the pins and the joins and the 6 places where it was drawn instead of cast. Nell sat on the edge of the raised floor with her arms round her knees and watched me do it for about an hour, and then she said, you are not measuring that to admire it. I said no. She said, how long? I said, most of a night, and I will want the light, and I will want the boy, and I will want to do it in front of them and not in the dark, or it will be a burglary instead of an argument. The sale happened in a small office on the 2nd floor of the Concord building on a wet afternoon in the autumn, half a year before I ever stood on that gray floor with a rule in my hand. There were 2 people in the room, and one of them told me about it afterwards, in full, without being asked, because she has never in her life seen the use of pretending a thing did not happen. Corvin Sallow had a difficulty. The finding had gone out, and the classification was made, and the fee was set, and applications had begun to come in from houses that could pay, and the office had no idea whatsoever how to execute one. A working is done by a summoner, and a summoner works to a form. Every beast on the roll comes through a form somebody wrote 300 years ago. There was no form for the new class because the new class had been made out of one accident in a mill town, and an accident is not a procedure. Verity Roque had a difficulty too, and hers is the older of the 2 and the more common. She wanted to leave Rethan, and she could not afford to. Passage to the far side is 19 silver marks on a working ship and 40 on anything better, and a place at a technical school on the other side is another 200 over 3 years. She had come out of a small school in a mill town with a good name and no money at all, so they sat down and were reasonable with each other for about an hour. There was no threat in that room. Nobody was blackmailed, nobody was bought in the sense that a man is bought, and neither of them said a single word that could not have been read out in front of anybody. That is what I keep coming back to about it. She did not sell him a secret because there was no secret. She sold him a manual. She sold the office a written form of the working in 3 sizes, with the tolerances, with the ring dimensions for each, with the fitting time and the hold time, and a schedule of training so that any clerk of the office with a season's instruction could execute one, and she sold the assessment that told them what class of imp would carry the light and at what rate. The office paid her 260 silver marks over 3 years and a letter of introduction. It is a fair price. It is roughly what a good engineer is paid anywhere for a piece of work that saves an institution from having to think. He asked her one question at the end of it, and she has repeated it to me twice with the same weight on the same word both times. He said, does the method require the man? She said no. I went to see her on the 7th day, in 2 rooms above a rope walk with a window that faced the water, and there were 3 trunks in the middle of the floor, and 2 of them were shut. She let me in and gave me tea, and sat down opposite me, and did not apologize for anything, and I had come up 2 flights of stairs with about a dozen sentences ready, and I did not use one of them. I said, 41 children. She said, I know the number. I read the same list you do. I said, you sold them the form. She said, I sold them the form. Then she put the cup down and said, and you made the class, and the class is the thing that matters, and a class with no form in it is a class that gets filled anyway by somebody worse than me inside 2 years. That is a convenient thing to believe, I said. She said, yes. It is also true, and both of those can sit in the same sentence, and if you have come here to make me choose between them, you will be here until the tide. Then she said the thing I had come 300 miles specifically not to hear. She said, you stood in a ring in front of 400 children and threw a drake, and then you spent 11 months proving in public, on purpose, at every muster, in front of the whole school, that one man is worth more to an institution than any animal it owns. You did that. You did it beautifully, and you did it because it kept a girl's peg on a wall, and I have not once said a word against your reasons. She said, I wrote down how. That is the whole of my crime, and I will take it. I said that she had asked me the questions in my own yard, and I had answered them for nothing. She said, you answered them because nobody had asked you in 2 months, and it felt good. Then she said, I know that. Because I chose the day. And I chose it after watching your yard for a fortnight, and if that makes you feel foolish, then I am sorry. But you are a grown man and I was 18 and I had a fortnight and no money. That is the only apology I ever got out of her, and it is attached to the wrong thing. And it is genuine, and I have decided to keep it. I told her what I was going to do. I told her because she was the one who lost by it and because I had spent a year learning from a 16-year-old that you say a thing to the face of the person it costs. I said I was going to cut the large ring out of the floor of the Concord Hall. She thought about it properly. She did not laugh, and she did not argue about whether I could, because she had the tolerances of that iron in a book in one of those trunks, and she knew to the quarter hour how long it would take. Then she said, it will not work. The class exists and the finding stands. The office will have new iron laid in 11 weeks, and it will cost them 90 marks, and they have 4,000. I said I knew that. She said, then why? And I said, because 140 people paid 2 coppers each to sit in that gallery and watch a 9-year-old be given a nurse, and if they are going to be a gallery, then they can be a gallery for this instead. And because after they have watched a man take that floor apart for a night with his own hands, there is not one clerk in that building who will ever again be able to say it is only a procedure. She looked at the water for a while. Then she said, that is not engineering. I said, no, it is not. It is the other thing. And I have watched a girl of 16 do it 4 times in a ring, and it worked on me every time. She saw us off from the office steps a fortnight later, which she did not have to do, and she stood there in the wind with her hands in her sleeves and did not wish me luck. And the last thing she ever said to me was, mind the pins on the north segment. They are wedged and not welded, and they will go before the bar does. She was right. They did. She sailed in the spring with 260 marks over 3 years and a letter, and she is on the far side now doing work I do not understand the name of, and by every account she is very good at it, and by every account she is not particularly happy. And I have no idea what to do with either of those facts. I sent for Sim Otley and for 9, and I sent for them properly, by letter, to a 13-year-old, asking whether he would come and stating what it was for and what could go wrong. He wrote back the same day. 4 lines. Yes. What would the rate have to be, he asked, and I told him 340 steady for 6 hours, which is more than that imp had ever done for more than 90 minutes. Then he asked the only sensible question anybody asked me that whole month, which was what happens to 9 if we hold him at 340 for 6 hours. I did not know, so I told him so. I do not know, I said, and if the number starts falling, we stop, and I finish it cold, and it takes 3 nights instead of 1, and that is allowed. He came up on the carrier with Baz Tulloch, who had not asked and was not invited and had simply got on the cart, and who brought the draw knife and the strop and a sack of charcoal, and who said, when I asked him what he thought he was doing, that a man cutting iron for a night needs somebody standing behind him whose only job is to look at his hands. Hesper Doone paid for all 3 of them and would not discuss it, and sent a note with the money that said, in a hand like a fence falling over, that she expected to be argued with about it on my return. We had 11 days. The office sits on the first of the spring quarter, and the schedule says the hall is open to the public on every day of the session, and I had read the whole of that schedule twice on a night when I could not sleep. Did the drawings in a room at the Bell and Anchor with Nell holding the other end of a string. 6 segments, 22 pins, 211 feet of large ring at a hand's width and a hand deep, bedded on lead in a cut channel in gray stone. 9 cuts. Not 1. That is what nobody understood beforehand, and it is the only thing about that night that was actually clever. You do not cut a ring in one place. A ring in one place is still a ring lying in a channel, and any competent hand relays it in a fortnight. You take the segments out. You cut at every join, lift each length, and you do it so that at the end, there is no piece on that floor long enough to be a rung of anything. And the pieces do not go in the river, because a thing in a river is a thing that has been hidden. They go on a cart, in daylight, up the mill road to Cold Harrow, with the charcoal. We came in through the public door on the first morning of the spring session with a handcart, at the hour the schedule says the hall is open, and we paid our 2 coppers each at the table, on the steps like everybody else. Angie Frett had insisted on that. She said, get a receipt. And I said it hardly seemed the point. And she said, love. In my trade, the receipt is always the point. And she got 5 of them and put them in her coat. There is nothing in the Concord schedule about the floor. There are 14 clauses about the conduct of a working, 4 about the gallery, 2 about the register, and 1 about the sweeping. There is a clause forbidding the obstruction of an officer of the office in the execution of his duty, and I read it about 40 times, and I could not make cutting a piece of iron out of a stone floor into the obstruction of a man. A familiar of the new class holds property, earns a wage, and stands as a witness in any court in Rethen. That is my finding. The hall was open to the public, and I was a member of it, and I had a handcart, a hacksaw frame, 9 blades, 2 levers, a plank, a boy with a jar, and a farrier of 51. They tried to stop me for 6 hours, and they tried it entirely properly, which is why it took 6 hours. The first man was a clerk. "This floor is the property of the office," he said. "I knew that," I said, "and I am not proposing to take it away," and I lifted the first bar and put it on the cart while he was looking for somebody more senior. The second was an under-marshal who asked me to leave, and I asked him under what clause, and he did not have one, and he went to get one. The third was a keeper of the hall who unrolled a length of rope round the raised floor and told the gallery to stand back, which was the single most useful thing anybody in that building did for me all day, because it made it a stage. By the second hour, the gallery was full at 2 coppers, and the office had stopped selling seats, and people were standing on the steps outside with the doors open. By the 4th hour, there was a boy going round with a tray of chestnuts, and the office had a marshal at the north door with an order in his hand that had not been signed. Corvin Sallow sat at the table on the east side of the raised floor for that entire day and that entire night, and he did not leave it once. And the order came to him at the 4th hour of the afternoon, and he read it twice and put it under his elbow. He never gave a reason. There is a note in the office record in his hand, which says that the presiding officer declined to sign an order of removal in respect of a person exercising a right of the class then before the office. What that means in ordinary language is that the order said I was not entitled to be there because I was a familiar, and the whole week's business was about what a familiar was entitled to, and Corvin Sallow was not going to have it decided by an under-marshal at 4 in the afternoon. Nell handled the gallery, and she did it with the schedule. She got up on the clerk's step at about the 3rd hour with the office's own printed copy in both hands, and she began at clause 1, and she read the whole of it out loud to 600 people, and when she got to the end, she went back to clause 1 and read it again. She read it 11 times over that night. She has a voice that carries much further than she means it to, and she still puts her breaths in the wrong places. And by the 4th reading, the gallery had started saying the fee clause along with her, and by the 7th, somebody up in the back corner was doing the coughs. I want to be honest about what that was, because it looked like a stunt, and it was not one. She read it because it was the only weapon she had ever been given, and because she had noticed something in it at Cold Harrow a year earlier that nobody else in that building had noticed, which is that the schedule sets a fee for registration and a fee for dissolution and a fee for assignment, and it does not anywhere set a fee for a working that fails. The office does not get paid for a ring that does not take. 600 people worked that out somewhere around the 5th reading, and after that, the atmosphere in that hall changed entirely, because a crowd that has understood the accounts is a different animal from a crowd that has come to look. The iron came up in 9 cuts, and it took me the whole of a night and about half of the following morning. The first 3 went well. A hand's width of bar, a hand deep, bedded in lead in a cut channel, and the art goes through that in something under 10 minutes if the rate holds and if you have the sense to cut on the pull and let the lead take the heat instead of the stone. Simotley sat on an upturned crate at my left shoulder with the jar between his boots and the hood in both hands, and he held 340 for the first 4 hours, which that imp had never done for more than 90 minutes in its life, and he did it by talking to it. Not a magic. He talked to it. 3 down, he said to it, and 6 to go, and he counted out loud between cuts, and at about the 2nd hour, he started telling it about the stove. He had never had a room with a fire in it. That is the whole of what he wanted out of the world, and he had never once said it to anybody, and he said it that night to a jar in front of 600 strangers because he had run out of anything else to talk about. He said, "When this is finished, there is going to be a shed with a stove in it, and I am going to be warm all winter," and Wes said so, and I asked him twice. I had said no such thing. I had never in 11 months thought about it for 1 second. I had put a boy on a bucket in a cold yard and taken his light off him every day since the frost, and I had asked him for a number every morning, and it had never once come into my head to ask him where he slept. The 4th cut is the north segment, and the pins there are wedged and not welded. Verity Roque had told me so, on a step in the wind, and she was right, and it went at about a third of the way through. The bar came round under its own tension with 200 pounds of iron behind it, and it came for my left knee, and I did not see it, because I was cutting and looking at the cut. Baz Tulloch put a lever in it. He was standing behind me the whole night, with a bar in his hands doing nothing, which is the most boring job in any trade and the one that only an old man will do properly. And he got 4 feet of steel into that gap in about a quarter of a second, and took the whole load on his shoulder and said nothing at all afterwards. I asked him about it later. "I told you what I came for," he said. "The rate started going at about the 5th hour. 340 came down to 300, then to 280. Sim did not tell me, and I did not need telling because the cut slows and you feel it in the frame, and I looked round and the boy had gone the color of a wet wall and was still counting. At 211 I shut the hood. That is the number he gave me on a step in the autumn on the first day I ever met him. I did not recognize it at the time, and I did not stop for that reason. I stopped because his hands were shaking on the hood and there were 4 cuts left, and I had told him in a letter that we would stop. He argued. That was new. That boy had never argued with anybody about anything, and he stood up in the middle of the Concord Hall and said, "It is still good. It always dips at the 5th hour and then it comes back." I said no. He said, "Please." I said no. And Nell came down off the clerk's step in the middle of clause 9 and took the jar off him and put it in the cart, and that was the end of that argument, because he will not fight her. So I did the last 4 cuts cold, on a hacksaw frame, on my knees, with Baz changing blades, and it took the rest of the night and most of the morning, and I got through 14 blades. A hacksaw goes through a hand's width of wrought bar in about 50 minutes if the blade is fresh, and the stroke is long, and you keep the pressure on the push and lift on the return. 50 minutes for 1 cut, 4 cuts, and a gallery of 600 people watching a man saw metal by hand for 3.5 hours, which is the least dramatic thing that has ever happened in that building. They did not leave. That is the thing I have never got over about that night. They had paid 2 coppers to watch a working, and instead, they watched a welder saw, and about 400 of them were still there at dawn, and at some point in the small hours, somebody in the 3rd row started counting the strokes out loud, and by the last cut, most of the hall was doing it. The 11th hour of the morning, the last segment came out of the channel, and I sat down on the floor of the Concord Hall with my back against the office table and could not open either hand. 211 feet of iron in 9 pieces, none of them long enough to be a ring or a rung or anything else, on a handcart and 2 borrowed barrows. The stone was still there. The channel was still cut. Somebody in that building could have had new iron in it in 11 weeks for 90 marks, and the office had 4,000, and every person in that hall knew it, including me. That was never what it was for. Corvin Sallow got up from the table at about noon when they had swept and came and stood over me with his hands behind him and asked me his question. He said, "Would you have done that if the ruling had gone the other way?" He knew the answer. He had known it since the 9th day at Cold Harrow. He asked it in the way he asks everything, which is slowly, and then he stood there and waited through the silence. And this time, I did not improve on the truth. I said no. If he had ruled I was a piece of property, I would have spent the year trying to get out from under it for myself, and I would never have gone near a hall in the capital, and 41 children would have been assigned 41 people, and I would have read about it on a cart notice at Cold Harrow. He said, "That is what I thought." Then he said, "Thank you," and went back to his table and sat down and wrote for about 2 hours. The finding came out on the last day of the session, and it is 4 lines long. It holds that a binding of the new class is void unless the person bound has given consent before the working, and that consent given after arrival is of no effect, and that no fee shall be taken in respect of a working that cannot show consent on the register. You cannot get consent from somebody who is standing on a bridge deck in another world. That is the whole of it. It does not free anybody. It does not touch the 41. It does not say one word about right or wrong, and it ends the trade completely, because the office cannot lawfully take the fee. It cost him his post, 246 marks a quarter and the classification with it, given up by a legate a season off his pension, on his own authority, in 4 lines, in a hand like a man ruling on a fence dispute. They did not dismiss him. They asked for his resignation on the grounds of the unsigned order, which was the only thing they had, and he gave it that afternoon and went home to a village in the Fen country, and he never made a statement about any of it to anybody. He went up the road to Cold Harrow on the 4th day of the spring with 9 lengths of conquered iron on a cart under a load of charcoal, and Ordish charged us the ordinary rate and grumbled about the weight all the way, and Sim Otley slept on top of it from the 2nd stage to Cold Harrow with his coat over the jar. The finding did not free one single person, and I need that said plainly, because there is a version going round Cold Harrow in which a man cut some iron up and everybody went home. The 41 stayed 41. That is what a closed class is. Nobody else could be brought through because the office could not lawfully take a fee for a working with no consent on the register. An office that cannot take a fee does not perform the service, and that is the whole of the mechanism, and there is nothing noble anywhere in it. But the 41 were still bound, and 9 were still on the steps, and Bettany Orne was still carrying trays at a school in Ashcroft for a girl of 9, and none of that was mended by anything I did on that floor. What actually mended some of it was Angie Frett, and she did it with a committee. A closed class of 41 is an administrative embarrassment that has to be maintained forever and cannot be added to, and an office in that position will listen to almost anybody who arrives with a proposal that costs nothing. She arrived with several. She got the released ones put on the office roll as maintained persons with a return of 2 coppers a day against the levy, which is a familiar's meal at any hatch in Wreathen. And she got it by pointing out that the office was already feeding 7 of them out of discretion, and would look considerably worse doing it by accident than on purpose. Then, she got herself appointed to survey the building she had been complaining about since the afternoon she arrived, on a wage, and the east wall came down in the autumn and went back up over the winter, and there is a lead run in it now with a fall on it. She writes to me twice a year. The letters are about drains, and they are the funniest correspondence I have ever received in my life, and in 5 years she has not once mentioned being summoned. The stove went into the shed in the second week we were back. I built it out of conquered iron, which is not an efficient use of 2-inch wrought bar and which nobody has ever complained about. A firebox, a plate top, a flue through the gable with a proper collar, and a bed at the back of the shed with a boarded partition and a door on it. The door has a latch and not a lock. He asked for that specifically, and I did not ask him why, and Nell told me later, which is that a boy who has slept in 6 places wants to be able to get out, not to keep people from getting in. Tim Otley has been warm every winter since. He was 15 that winter, and he had a wage of 1 mark the month out of the yard, and Baz Tulloch took to teaching him feet, badly at first and then well, because a boy in a shed is a pair of hands that do not hurt in the cold. I am a little jealous about that, and I have not mentioned it to anybody, and it costs me nothing to own up to it now, which is most likely the only reason I can. The yard came back the way it went, which is to say, a person at a time, and none of it was dramatic. The ferret girl had never left. Hoyt Pemble came the second day with Majesty and a list of 4 other people's animals, which he had gone round and collected without being asked, and he told the carriage story at the bench and got to the pie. The third year with the lizard came back. Then a groom with a burn scar came down with a drake that had a plate in its side with my rivet in it, and stood there. His lordship wants the near shoulder looked at, he said, and it was looked at in Yarrow, and it was not looked at properly. Then the school itself started sending, which is different from a student sending, because the school has a key and a ledger and a man who signs for it. By midsummer, there were 14 animals on the board on a Tuesday, and Baz had the pricing on anything with a foot in it and would not be argued with about it, and Dovie Ashlyn had appointed herself to the business of talking to people in the queue, which is a real job, and which none of the rest of us can do. One I remember out of all of it is a bearhound belonging to a 4th year called Pettifer, who had laughed at me in a gallery in the autumn and who came down to that yard with his cap actually in his hand. The animal had a shoulder that dropped under load. I made him a yoke and a cross strap, and he took it away, and a fortnight later he came back and stood there and said, in front of about 10 people, that it worked and that he had been wrong in the autumn, and that he would like to say so where people could hear it. I said it was 2 marks and 4. He paid it. That is the only apology I have ever been paid for, and I have thought about it a good deal since, and I still do not know whether I handled it well. The gate went up at the end of the summer. 9 lengths of conquered iron, drawn and forged in 6 segments with the joints pinned, 211 feet of it, and the only sensible thing to make out of that quantity of good bar is a gate. And Baz said so first, and I have let him have the credit for it ever since because he is right and because he is 51. It is 11 feet across, and it hangs on 2 posts we set in stone, and the bars are the bars, still bedded with the lead scars on them where they came out of the channel, and we did not clean the lead off. Everybody who comes into that yard walks through it. Everybody who ever came to laugh, everybody who ever came to buy, every animal the school owns, and one drake who sleeps across the bottom of it in the sun and has to be walked round. The species question came back one final time in the autumn, when the office sent a clerk up to enter the 41 on the maintained roll, and he needed a trade for the column. I said welder. He wrote engineer. That is not what I said, I said. Engineer is in the schedule, he said, and welder is not, and the schedule is what I have. And I let him have it, because after 11 of these, I have learned that the man with the form always wins, and it has never once mattered. 11 officials, 11 answers, human, unnatural, artisan, familiar, unclassified, welder, unascertained, welding, engineer, not one of them wrong and not one of them the same, and Nell has kept every copy in a bundle in the coat with the 2 letters. Nell Ferrow reached 200 silver marks on the 19th day of the spring, in a purse, in coin, counted twice. She had been at it for a year and a half, copying registers at a copper an hour, which she never stopped doing. The yard's share, which she took as pricing clerk and would not take as anything else, because she said a summoner who takes a cut of her familiar's work is exactly what the schedule thinks she is. Then the pricing itself, which she turned out to be frightening at, because a girl who has been poor at a school full of rich children knows to the copper what everybody in that yard can actually afford and will not be talked past it. Her hands were not a 16-year-old's hands by the end of it. She had a burn across the back of the left one from a strap she should not have been holding, and a permanent split at the base of the thumb, and she is proud of the second one in a way I find hard to be near. 200 marks in silver is her year at the circles. It is the number in the letter in her coat, and it is the number the Northern Factor said out loud in a ring in front of 200 people, and it is the number Anselm Bittern wrote in pencil in a register in the winter with a line under it. And it is the number on my entry, which is what the schedule prices a dissolution at, because the fee for dissolving a binding of the new class is set at the valuation entered on the register, and nobody ever went back and rubbed out the pencil. A dead man's arithmetic. He is not dead. He is in a room over a tallow works at the mill end, and the house on the river went to a corn factor in the autumn. She worked all of that out about a year before I did, which I know, because when I finally said it out loud in the shed, she did not react at all. I said, 200 is your year. She said, 200 is a great many things. I said, if you spend it on the other one, you do not come back after midsummer. She said, I know. Then she said, I have known since the winter, and I have been doing the sum every week since the winter, and I would like you to not do it at me now as though it is new. I said, All right. And she said, good, and picked the strap up again, which is what that girl does instead of finishing a conversation. I did not tell her which one to spend it on. That was the one piece of restraint I managed in 2 years, and it nearly killed me. And I only managed it because I had spent a year watching what happens when a grown man answers for a 16-year-old at a table. Baz Tulok told me I was a coward about it. He said it at the anvil without turning round. That is where he says everything, and what he said was, "You have not told her because you are afraid of which one she picks, Wes." That was true, I said. He said, "Which one are you afraid of?" And I did not answer him, and he let it go, and about a month later he said, from the same anvil, in the same voice, that he had worked out the answer and that I would not like it. He was right. What I was afraid of was that she would spend it on the school, and stay, and be sensible, and that I would be pleased for her, and that I would spend the rest of my life knowing that the arithmetic had been done, and I had come second to a year of tuition. That was the correct answer. Hesperdoon offered to pay the fee. Of course she did. She sent a note in the falling fence hand, and I walked down the mill road to say no to her in person, and she made me sit on her left for the first 10 minutes out of pure habit. I said it was not mine to accept and not hers to give. She said, "That is the correct answer," and I knew it before I sent the note, and I sent it anyway, because I am 69 and I have got very tired of being right. Then she said, "And does the girl know you would have taken it 2 years ago?" And I said yes, because that is the thing about Nell Ferrow. She knows all of it. She has known since the coach house and the 2 fires and the door with 1 key on it, and she has never once used it, and she never will. Muster fell on the last day of the summer. The wall is repainted at midnight and the pegs move at midnight, and the office sits at the awning at the close for instruments of dissolution, the same as it sits for anything else, because the schedule does not care what an afternoon means to anybody. She went down to the office table at the second bell of that morning, 11 hours before the ring even opened, with a purse and a paper, and she did not tell me she was going. Marta Ferrow came up the mill road on the carrier's cart on the morning of the last muster and paid her own fare and did not send word ahead to anybody. She is 24 and she married a man with land at Ashcroft, and she was 3rd in her year at the circles 8 years ago, and she stood at the back of the West Bank in a good coat with the sleeves too long for the weather and did not go down to the rail. Nell did not see her until the 8th turn. The task that day was a pair of harness elk that had to be cross-hitched and taken twice round the ring under load, which is a 2-person job for a summoner and a beast and is a 3-person job if the beast has hands. Did it in 9 minutes. I want to be accurate about the credit on that one, because it is the last piece of work in this account, and it was not mine. The near animal would not stand for the second hitch. It had been rushed at Yarrow as a 2-year-old, and it will not have a hand come at its head from the left, and that is not a thing you can see from the ring, and I did not know it, and neither did the stewards. Nell went to its head from the right and put her whole arm over the nose and stood there talking to it in a completely level voice about the schedule of the Cold Harrow School of Summoning, clause by clause, while I got the hitch on from underneath. She got to clause 4. The elk stood the whole way through clause 4, and I do not think I have ever been so glad to hear about a registration fee. They scored the pair first of 12 on the handling and not on the time, because Rosalind Teague was back on the ring that year, and Rosalind Teague scores handling. And she came down off the plank stand afterwards and said, to Nell and not to me, that was the best minute of work anybody has done in that ring since she came to this school. And she said, and get that arm looked at. And Nell said it was nothing, and it was a burn the width of a finger, and she has still got the mark. The instrument was read out at the close under the awning, in front of the banks, because the office reads out every instrument it takes that day, and there is no discretion in it anywhere. I did not know it was there. She had gone down at the second bell that morning, 11 hours earlier, with a purse and a paper, and she had counted 200 silver marks onto that table in 12 stacks and had the fee taken and the entry made and the pencil valuation struck through and initialed, and then she had gone and got into the ring with me and worked a pair of elk and said nothing at all. The clerk read it in the flat voice they use. Dissolution of a binding of the closed class, on the instrument of the summoner's own hand and her own mark, the fee paid in full at the valuation entered, no cause assigned, and none required. And he said the name and my name, and then he said, effective on the reading, and put the paper down. 900 people made no sound at all. I have been asked a great many times since what I thought about at that moment, and the honest answer is that I thought about the pencil. 9 months of a man turning a ring of keys over in his palm and writing a number in a register that nobody had offered, so that a house could be shown a figure, so that he could take a fee on a price he had invented himself. That number bought me. She paid it to a table. Baz Tulok took the collar off me at the rail. He did it because he was the nearest, and because somebody had to, and because a man of 51 does not stand about at a moment like that waiting to be asked. It hangs open on a nail by the forge in the lower yard, and it has been there ever since. Nobody put it there for a reason. He walked back and hung it up because his hands were full. She came off the sand and stood in front of me with the elk still going out behind her, and said nothing at all because she had used up everything she had at that table at the second bell and there was nothing left over. So I said it. I said, you have spent your year. She said, I have spent something. I said, you do not come back after midsummer. She said, no. And then, because she is who she is, she added that the fee schedule prices dissolution at the valuation on the register and not at the value of anything. And that she wanted that on the record because people were going to say she had paid 200 marks for a welder, and the true figure was that she had paid 200 marks for a Proctor's pencil. I said I had understood it the first time. She said sorry. Then she explained the last piece of it again anyway, slower, in case the fault had been hers, and I stood in the sand and let her, because I had a morning of not being asked to get through, and it was as good a way as any. Then I said the only thing I had ready, which was that a released familiar with no place of return is a man in a yard with no coin and no roll and no house. She said, I know. I read that one before I read any of the others. I said, so. She said, so nothing. I am not offering you anything, and that is the point of it. If I offered you something, it would be the same afternoon again with better manners on it. Then she picked up the chalk bag off the rail and walked out of the ring and did not look round to see whether I was following. And that is the single bravest thing I have watched anybody do, and she was 17 years old by 2 months. I followed her. Obviously, I followed her. The wall goes up at midnight, and the pegs are moved by the children themselves, and she went up the west stair at about the 11th hour with her sleeve over her hand because the pegs are cold, and took hers out of the 9th slot and put it in the first. 12th of 12 in the autumn of the first year. 1st of 12 at the end of the second. Then off the wall entirely, because a child who is not returning after midsummer comes off the list at the turn of the year, and somebody else's peg goes into the slot. She stood in front of it for a good while afterwards, longer than the moving takes, exactly as she had the first time. Marta was on the stair. She had come up behind us, and she had been standing 4 steps down for some minutes, and neither of us had heard her. She said, first. Nell said yes. Marta said, I was third, and then she stopped, and there was about 10 seconds of nothing on that staircase, and then she said, I did not come to say anything clever. I came because they read a thing out in a ring, and I wanted to be in the building. Nell said, all right. That is the entire conversation between those two women on that stair, and I have never managed to improve it, and I have tried, because I spent a year hearing about a sister, and I had a dozen speeches prepared, and none of them were wanted by anybody. Marta stayed 4 days. She helped in the yard, badly, in a good coat, and she was very funny about the coat by the 3rd day, and she has come back every summer since. The yard at midsummer looks like this, and I am going to put it down carefully, because I have carried it about with me for 5 years, and I would like it to be somewhere. There is a gate 11 feet across made out of conquered iron, with the lead scars still on the bars, and everybody who comes in walks through it, and a drake sleeps across the bottom of it in the sun, and has to be walked round, and has never once helped anybody with anything. There is a shed with a stove in it, and a boarded partition, and a door with a latch and not a lock, and a young man of 20 asleep behind it in the middle of the afternoon because he was up half the night with a hound, and a jar on a hook by the bench making light and not failing at it. There is a farrier of 56 with his name on the gate above mine, standing over an anvil pretending to supervise, while a boy does the lifting because his hands hurt in the cold and he has never once said so out loud and never will. There is Hoyt Pemble on the mounting step telling 2 people about the day he almost saw the royal carriage, and both of them are letting him get to the pie, and Majesty is lying behind him in a chest frame with 31 rivets in it that is never opened. There is Dovey Ashlyn in the queue talking to a girl with a ferret, saying nothing whatsoever about any of it, which is what she has done for 5 years and what she is best at. There is Rosalind Teague at the gate with her hands behind her, and the collar is not on her belt anymore. It came off in the spring. She has not used the second summoning, and she says every autumn that she is thinking about it, and one of these years she is going to be telling the truth. And there is a woman of 22 in an apron with chalk on 3 fingers, who is not a summoner, and has never been on any roll since the year she left, taking the pricing on anything that comes through that gate and being frightening at it. Collar hangs open on a nail behind the forge. I could go anywhere. That is the whole of what she bought with 200 silver marks and a pencil line, and she has never once mentioned it, and I have been standing in that yard for 5 years. People ask me sometimes which of the 2 of us actually got summoned that morning. I was 34. I had a folding knife, a lighter with a week in it, a bent tape, 1 burnt glove, and a bootlace, and I had a shift to finish and nothing at all after it. She was 16 with chalk on 3 fingers and her name at the bottom of a wall, and she was waiting for a wolf. Somebody came out of that ring with a life that morning. I have done the arithmetic on it a good many times, and I have never once got it to come out as me.
What this one was about was not a man who could weld. It was about what happens to somebody when a price for them gets said out loud, in public, in front of a crowd that laughs. Nearly everyone in it wanted one small private thing and would have traded a little of the common good to get it, and most of them did, and hardly any of them were villains for it. The lesson it leaves is the one the girl kept paying for, in coppers, in front of witnesses, over 2 years. You can be useful to people and still be owned by them. The only thing that turns being kept into being chosen is somebody spending what they cannot spare, and then standing there afterwards and asking for nothing back.